Leonardo Antonelli, A Dark Mafia Romance. Brutal Attachments, Book 1. By ZZ Brulon. Copyright 2023 LFD Romance Books, all rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including information storage and retrieval systems, without the written permission of the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review.
1. Leonardo. I hadn't been able to sleep for the last 3 days. This was something I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. Or maybe I would, and that's why it was happening to me. The minute I locked eyes with her, I knew that I had to have her. Nothing would stand in my way. I immediately contacted my head security man, Wilson. I told him to track her for as long as necessary until he had dug up every possible piece of information on her. I had to know. I was obsessed. I anticipated that she would probably have a boyfriend, maybe even a husband. That didn't bother me. This wouldn't be the first time that I had to dispose of someone. But usually, when I had to do that dirty work, it was about business, and rarely ever personal. But to have that woman, to possess her, to make her mine, and no one else's, I was willing to do anything. Whatever man, no matter how powerful, no matter how vicious, would be dealt with. My men would bring him to me. It hadn't taken Wilson long to dig up the information. My face lit up as he walked into my office. But something about his expression sent a shiver down my spine. He looked sick. Deathly pale. "Wilson, is everything okay?" He swallowed hard before answering, slowly raising his head and staring at me. "Sir, is this some type of joke?" he asked. I frowned. I could feel the veins beginning to tense in my neck. "What the hell are you talking about?" I barked at him. "I'm talking about the young woman that you had me follow, sir. You really don't know who she is?" "Damn it, Wilson," I said, slamming my fist on my desk. "If I knew who the woman was, do you think I would be sending you out there to follow her?" He bit his bottom lip, then shook his head from side to side as if he was afraid to reveal whatever information he had discovered. His hesitation only made me more anxious, more annoyed, but also more desperate to know who she was. "Sir, she's 22 years old, a virgin, and recently graduated from a small liberal arts school." "Tell me her name," I screamed, standing up and glaring at him. "Caroline Chambers," he replied, looking away. My mouth gaped open. I plopped back down into the chair. I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest. It couldn't be true. There was no way. I was being paranoid. Jumping to conclusions. "Chambers?" I said. "As in Chambers Realty & Co.?" "Yes, sir," Wilson replied. "The same Chambers that your family has been fighting tooth and nail against for the last 100 years. The same evil family that drove your father to an early grave. And led your mother to commit suicide a few weeks later." Ever since that brief meeting with Wilson, my head had been spinning. I hadn't been able to sleep more than a couple hours without waking up in a cold sweat. All those memories that I had fought hard to push away, fought so hard to suppress, they all came surging back. 5 years ago, everything that my family had built over generations had nearly fallen apart in a matter of weeks. There had been false accusations against my father spread in the media. He'd been set up just as he was on the verge of completing one of the biggest real estate deals in New York history. It was something that was going to be talked about all around the world. It was going to take the family to heights that surpassed even our own grand ambitions. Of course, the competition for the sports complex and condo project had been fierce. All the biggest developers from around the world wanted in on it. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But as was often the case, my father knew all the right strings to pull and all the right doors to knock on. Many of the competitors who'd lost out were furious with him. Some had even threatened to take legal action, alleging bribery and corruption. None of those threats ever bothered him. He simply laughed them off. Bribery and corruption were how everything got done in Manhattan real estate. It had always been like that. And it always would be. Tough luck. The game is what it is, he would often say. Either learn how to play it or get out. But not everybody was able to just move on and go in search of other deals. And when I say not everybody, I mean only one group of bastards, one family with a bloodline that had been tainted for generations, full of crooks, thieves, bootleggers, and cutthroats. They had it all in their family. The feud had first started during Prohibition. The Chambers versus the Antonellis. The Chambers had a stranglehold on the underground pubs and speakeasies. Nobody could sell booze in the city without paying them off. If you refused, Within days the police would raid your spot and lock up anybody they wanted to. And sometimes, if you really pissed them off, your loved ones would have to come down to the morgue to identify your body. They were cold, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. Nobody ever dared to challenge them, at least not openly. Sure, plenty of bootleggers tried to sneak around them, do whatever it took to stay under the radar, and avoid facing their exorbitant fees or their murderous wrath. But to actually stand up to them, let alone to declare war on them, you would have had to be crazy. And that's exactly what my great-grandfather, Joseph Antonelli, was. Crazy. Or maybe he'd felt that since he'd survived the trip from Sicily, coming from nothing, he really had nothing to lose. He'd seen tougher, meaner bastards than the Chambers. He hadn't left everything behind in the old country and come to America to live like a coward. He was full of ideas and ambition. But he needed money to bankroll them. And at the time bootlegging seemed like the best option. He assembled a crew of fellow immigrants and they began offering protection to the bars who were constantly under threat by the Chambers gang. Of course, that didn't go over very well. The Chambers weren't used to being challenged. Especially not by a ragtag group of immigrants that they had very little respect for. In their mind, my great-grandfather needed to be humble and work menial jobs, stay in this place, on his knees, begging and groveling. Thankfully, for the succeeding generations of my family, Joseph Antonelli had very different ideas about what his place was. I got out of bed and walked around my darkened bedroom. It could be so lonely in here sometimes. So much money, so much status, so much power, but I still had no one to share it with. I still had no one to continue my legacy. Sure, I was only 25. There was plenty of time for me. But with the way things had worked in my family, I had the feeling that an early death awaited me. Whether it would be the stress, an enemy's bullet, or some unfortunate accident, I couldn't help feeling that I didn't have much time. I sighed heavily and bit down on my bottom lip. I could feel my chest tightening. I hated these haunting, morbid thoughts. But at times I just couldn't shake them and pretend that everything was all right. This wasn't the life that I'd chosen. It had chosen me. And of course, I was proud of the family name, proud of everything that we'd accomplished. But I wanted something of my own. I wanted something that I could build with my own brains and brawn. But that ambition would have to be put on hold. I had a more important mission to attend to. Revenge. And Caroline Chambers would be the object of my rage. She would be the one to suffer, to scream out in pain. She would be the one to pay for what they'd done to my great-grandfather. They'd tied both him and his wife up in a basement and had tortured them for 2 weeks straight. Taunting them, beating them, burning their flesh. And eventually cutting off their hands and throwing their bodies into a dumpster. Before we had the chance to exact revenge, the police had come in and broken up both bootlegging rings. The pain, anger, and hurt had lived in our family for generations. But we had tried to move on. We had tried to put that part of our family history behind us. Yes, it was important, and it had made us who we were, but now we were legit. We no longer had to operate in the criminal world. No longer had to look over our shoulders. We were respected and admired. My hands tightly gripped the steering wheel of my tinted-out black Audi. I'd been waiting across the street from Parsons Design School for the last 20 minutes. From the information that Wilson had given me, Caroline attended graduate school classes here 4 days a week from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. Then she headed home to her family's Upper West Side mansion. I trusted the information that Wilson had passed on to me. But I needed to see for myself. I could hardly resist the urge to grab her off the street. But I knew that I had to be patient. It wouldn't be long until I got my hands on her. She wouldn't see it coming. Just like my great-grandfather hadn't seen it coming. I was going to bring her down into my dungeon. Nobody would hear her screams and her cries, her pleas for mercy and forgiveness. Of course, she would claim that she had nothing to do with her family's activities. Nothing to do with their past. She would try to win my sympathy. She would promise to do everything that I wanted her to do if I would only let her go. I'd already played out the scenario in my mind for hours and hours, tossing and turning in bed. I'd be merciless with her. The more she screamed, the more she begged, the rougher I would be with her. But what was the point? What was my ultimate objective? For several days I had asked myself those questions. Would unleashing my sadistic impulses on her truly be enough to satisfy me? I didn't think so. I wanted more. Much more. I wanted her total and complete submission. I wanted her to renounce that cursed family name of hers. I would make her an Antonelli. I would pump my seed into her and make her mine. She would never want anything to do with her family ever again. She would never again associate with any of the men in her family. I would teach her to hate them as much as I did. But of course, I wanted her to make the choice for herself. I wouldn't penetrate her until she was dripping wet, begging and pleading for me to pump my cock into her, for me to shoot my seed deep into her womb, wanting more than anything else in the world to be the mother of my children. Maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe my mind was twisted and poisoned. Maybe I needed to do something to extricate this hate from my heart, something that didn't require kidnapping and torturing. But I couldn't think of anything else that would be more satisfying. "Sir, are you sure that this is really the best idea?" Wilson asked me, his voice quivering. I was tempted to get up from my desk, rush towards him, grab him by the back of the neck and drag him out of my office. But I managed to control myself, smiling wickedly. For the last several hours, I hadn't been able to think about anything else except how I was going to exact my revenge on the Chambers. Caroline was an only child. There was no male heir to continue the family line. So they were going to die out soon anyway. I would just be speeding up the process.
2. Caroline. When I went away to school, I swore that I would never come back to Manhattan. I didn't have anything of my own. Even though I could walk the streets and see my family name on some of the most important buildings in the city. Even though I could go into the fanciest restaurants and be immediately recognized and seated. That really had nothing to do with me. It was the family name. And of course, everything had to be done to preserve the family name, I was always told. As if I was too stupid and naive to know any of the things that we'd done for generations to create that name. I didn't want any part of that. I didn't want to be attached to either the good or the bad things that came along with being a Chambers. I just wanted to be Caroline, a struggling art student, a young woman trying to make her way in a man's world. Whatever stupid cliché I could think of seemed better than what I actually was. A spoiled, rich, entitled brat, who'd had everything given to her but who was still dissatisfied with life. "Don't worry," my mother would often tell me. "Once you meet a nice man, get married, and have some kids, everything will work out." The only way I could respond to such a ridiculous statement was by sighing and rolling my eyes. A nice man? What the hell was that? And there was no way I could see getting married and having kids, basically putting a ball and chain around my ankles, as something that would lead to happiness. No, there had to be another way. I wasn't even dating. Couldn't remember the last time I'd spent an evening with a guy who excited me, made me tingle all over and made my face light up. No, I definitely hadn't met those types of guys as an undergrad. And that's why at 22 I was still a virgin. But maybe something was wrong with me. I wasn't sure. Everything seemed to bore me. I felt like a zombie half the time, marching through my day without any direction or purpose. Was this how the rest of my life was going to be? Maybe my mother would end up being right after all. And I was just lying to myself, thinking that there was some grand mission for my life. Maybe the best thing to do would be to find a man who I could tolerate, pump out a few kids, and try to live happily ever after. I looked around the coffee shop, scanning the different faces, hoping to find a kindred soul, somebody who was as lost and confused as I was. But everyone in there seemed to be banging away on a laptop. They all seemed to have a purpose, a direction in which they were going, or at least something to distract them and occupy their time. It seemed like I had none of those things, but I also couldn't help feeling that so many of those people, if they knew who I was, they knew my family name, would have enthusiastically traded places with me. The ringing of my cell phone snapped me out of my self-pitying reverie. I sighed and shook my head when I saw Mom on the screen. I didn't want to pick it up. I knew what she was going to say. I'd heard it all before. And I was sick of it. I wanted out of this life. But I had nowhere to go. I sighed one more time and finally answered the call. "Yes, Mom," I said, my voice full of exasperation. "Caroline, are you okay? Where are you?" Her panicked voice came through the phone. My eyes opened wide. I'd never heard her like this before. "What happened?" I asked. "Your father was attacked. He's in the hospital." "What?" I asked, not quite understanding what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "Those bastards. They did it. After all this time, they finally did something." "Mom, what are you talking about? Who did this?" "The Antonellis." A shiver went through my body when I heard that name. I didn't know the full story. But I knew that there had been a generations-long hatred between the Chambers and the Antonellis. Whenever the subject came up, I would either put on my headphones or leave the room, so there were a lot of details that I didn't know. But from what I gleaned from my parents and other family members, the Antonellis were some of the worst people you could ever wish to run into. They'd been steeped in criminality ever since they first arrived on American soil. "Tell me where you're at," my mother said. "I'll send the car for you. It's too dangerous for you to be walking around." Too dangerous to be walking around? I thought to myself. But I didn't have anything to do with this. I'd never done anything for the family business. Why would they want to hurt me? After waiting outside the coffee shop for about 10 minutes, I started to get nervous. I'd given my mother the address. And she told me that the car would be there in a couple of minutes. This still didn't make sense to me. I had never involved myself with any part of the family business. Actually, I'd done everything not to be involved, everything to know as little as possible about what was going on. I knew there were bodies buried somewhere. But I had no idea where. And as far as I was concerned, it was none of my business. But maybe the Antonellis or whoever had done this to my father felt differently. Maybe just because I had the Chambers name, the Chambers blood running through my veins, was enough to make me a target too. It was a sickening feeling. I hated thinking that I would be associated with all the evil things we'd done through generations. More than ever I wanted to be free, to be my own person, to start over, and have a clean slate. But that seemed more impossible than ever. Would it ever be possible for me to run away? If the Antonellis were as ruthless and cold-hearted as everyone in my family seemed to think, there was no way that they would ever want me to live in peace. Which meant that I would need my family's money, protection, power, and influence more than ever. What a cruel twist of fate. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. I quickly wiped them away. I was so sick of feeling sorry for myself. So sick of feeling helpless. There had to be more to life than this. I looked up. A black SUV was speeding towards me. It came to a skidding stop right in front of me. The doors opened. Two huge men in dark-colored suits and sunglasses came toward me. I opened my mouth to speak but no words came out. My legs wobbled beneath me. I felt like I was going to faint. Before I fell to the ground, the men took hold of my arms and legs. They threw me into the back seat of the van. I screamed. I cried out. I beat my fists against the darkened windows. The doors shut and the car skidded off. A powerful hand covered my mouth, suffocating my cries. What was going on? Where were they taking me? Who had sent them? "If you promise to keep your fucking mouth shut," one of the men said, "I'll take my hand off of it." "Okay." My chest heaved. Sweat dripped down my forehead. I'd never felt more terrified. There were so many questions that I wanted to ask them. But I knew that this wasn't the time. I had to somehow get control of my emotions. Maybe I could persuade them to not hurt me, to have some sort of mercy on me. "Yes, sir," I managed to say through my quivering lips. "I'll do anything you want. Just please don't hurt me." "Okay." He took his hand away from my mouth but he didn't respond. I wasn't sure whether that was good or bad. Moments later, I noticed that we were pulling into the NYU Medical Center parking lot. My eyes grew wide with surprise. I couldn't believe it. These were the men that my mother had sent to pick me up. This was how things were done in the family business. Unfucking believable. I felt like screaming and banging my fists against the windows. But before I had a chance to do that, the doors opened and I was being dragged out of the vehicle into the hospital. I covered my mouth and my eyes opened wide with shock as I walked into the hospital room and saw my father lying in the bed. There were all sorts of wires and tubes coming out of him. His face was badly bruised. Both his eyes were nearly swollen shut. I'd never seen him so weak and vulnerable. It was horrifying. "Don't worry," my mother said, rushing toward me. "It's not as bad as it looks." I had no idea how to reply to that. I wrapped my arms around her. I wanted to go towards my father, grab him, lay my head on his chest, and cry. But he looked so weak. So delicate. I was afraid to touch him. His head slowly turned towards me. He smiled and then winced in pain. "Dad, what happened?" I asked, choking back the tears. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said in a strained voice. "It's going to be a little bit harder to kill me than that." I wiped away a few tears. Then I went towards him and gently kissed him on the cheek. Our hands interlocked. I squeezed with all my force, with all my love. He tried to reciprocate. But he didn't have much strength. Yet the expression on his face showed that he was trying his best. For the next several minutes my mother explained to me what had happened. Or at least what they thought had happened. My father had been going for his morning 10-mile bike ride around Central Park when out of nowhere somebody charged him and knocked him to the concrete. His helmet cracked on impact. Thank God he was wearing it. He had a few scratches and bruises. But nothing too serious. The bike wasn't too badly damaged either. "What the hell are you doing, man?" he'd yelled at the guy who had knocked him over. "Can't you see where you're going?" At this point, he still felt that it was accidental. Just one of those stupid things that can happen every now and then to a cyclist. But seconds later he found himself surrounded by 5 guys. They had cold, hard, emotionless faces. He knew right away that there was nothing accidental about this. He also knew that this wasn't some random robbery attempt. The biggest man in the group stepped forward, reached down, and grabbed my father's shirt. He lifted him onto his feet and then hoisted him into the air. My father was over 6 feet and solidly built, so any man capable of handling him so easily must have been massive. I trembled at the thought of ever encountering someone like that. "It must be nice to enjoy the sunshine on a day like this, isn't that right, Mr. Chambers?" "What the hell do you guys want?" my father replied sharply. "Who sent you here?" "Those are very interesting questions, Mr. Chambers," the man replied, slowly lowering my father to the ground but continuing to tightly grip his shoulders. "My name is John Luigi Antonelli." Upon hearing the name Antonelli, my father trembled with rage. He knew immediately that this wasn't going to end well. And he also knew that there was no point in begging and pleading. "I'm the great-grandson of Joseph Antonelli, the man. I don't give a shit about you. Or that fucking scoundrel Joseph Antonelli, what the fuck do you?" And before my father could finish his reply, a fist landed in his stomach, cutting his words short. Several more body blows followed until he was eventually knocked to the ground. That's when they began kicking him in his chest, back, and ribs. "Who the fuck do you think you're talking to, Chambers? Your family is gonna pay for what you did. Your pain will be 10 times worse than ours." My father wanted desperately to curse them out, to hurl disrespect and insults into their enraged faces. But he had no chance. He could slowly feel the energy being drained from him. Could feel the blood leaking from different parts of his body as he lay on the concrete being beaten to a bloody pulp. And it wasn't long before everything went black and he lost consciousness. "There were about 8 of them," my father said, wincing once again as he squirmed in the hospital bed. "But that wasn't enough to stop me." My mother sighed and rolled her eyes. "Michael, it looks like they did a pretty good job of stopping you. You won't be going anywhere for the next few weeks." "A few weeks? I've got the Brighton Yards meeting in a couple days," he said. "This is the biggest opportunity we've had in almost 20 years. My mother bit down on her bottom lip and looked away. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to know. I had never involved myself in the family business and I wanted to keep things like that. But standing there looking at my father in a hospital bed made my blood boil. Who were these Antonellis? What gave them the right to go around beating people up and almost killing them? Against my better instincts, I cleared my throat and asked, "What's Brighton Yards?" Both my parents turned toward me. Their faces were full of surprise but also apprehension. They must have been wondering, just like I was, why the hell I was asking questions about the family business. "It's a huge condo development project in the meatpacking district," my mother replied. "Your father has been working on the deal for almost 2 years. But aren't there plenty more deals we can get?" I asked, barely catching the fact that I had used "we" to refer to a business that I had never been a part of. My parents seemed to catch it too. "If Chambers Realty and Company doesn't get this deal, then we're finished," my father said. "What do you mean by finished?" I asked, terrified of what his answer would be but unable to suppress my curiosity. "Sweetie," my mother began. "Your father has had to take lots of risks over the last few years. Things haven't quite worked out the way we had imagined. And we're currently in a lot of debt." There was only one logical next question, but I still didn't want to ask it. I swallowed hard. The silence in the room was suffocating. "How much debt?" I asked. My parents looked at each other. My father shut his eyes, threw his head back, and sighed. 100 million, he said. "And it goes up every day." My eyes opened wide. I couldn't believe what he'd just said. By how much? I asked. By 10%, my mother replied.
3. Leonardo. For the past 20 minutes, I've been walking back and forth in my office, veins bulging in my forehead and neck. I couldn't believe what they'd done. Especially John Luigi, because he was the one I had trusted to lead the operation. But once again, my younger brother had shown that he wasn't able to keep his cool, and wasn't able to stay focused on the mission at hand. Beating the shit out of Chambers was not a part of the plan. I definitely wanted them to intimidate him. To let him know that we were keeping a close eye on him. But most importantly, I wanted them to inform him that we knew all about his quite significant financial problems. He'd taken a lot of big risks over the last several years. And just about every one of them had failed. His only chance of being able to pay back that debt would be securing the contract for the Brighton Yards development. But that wasn't going to happen. I had already made sure of that. Antonelli Realty and Company wouldn't be getting the deal either. And that was just fine with me. I had never really believed in that project anyway, despite how much hype it had gotten in the press. So what was Chambers going to do now? He owed more than 100 million. And from what I understood, the debt went up each day. He was either going to end up dead or in federal prison for a long time. I doubted that he wanted either one of those outcomes. I suspected that he would do anything in his power to avoid facing those consequences. And that worked right into my hands. I would be able to, as they say, make him an offer that he couldn't refuse. I smiled sadistically, rubbing my palms together. What a brilliant and diabolical plan I had come up with. It all seemed so simple. So straightforward. But then my goddamn, hot-headed, younger brother had almost fucked everything up. I slammed my fist against the desk. They'd almost killed the old bastard. But thankfully, according to my sources in the hospital, he was going to pull through. That was a great relief. My plan could only work if the old man was still alive. I heard a fleet of cars pulling into the driveway. I picked up my phone and called my brother. "Hey, we're coming up," he said. "No, I don't want your goons stomping through my mansion," I yelled into the phone. "But you better get your ass up here ASAP." "Yes, sir, I'll be right there," he said in his most sarcastic voice. I cursed under my breath and shook my head. Before our father's untimely heart attack and our mother's suicide, John Luigi had been the shyest, sweetest, most introverted kid. But in the wake of their passing, a dark cloud had come over him. He started getting into trouble at school, fighting with other kids, not doing his homework, and then eventually beating the crap out of a teacher. He'd been suspended from school and eventually, they decided to kick him out. But he didn't give a shit. He'd learned all he could from school, or so he thought. In either case, he was fully committed to being as much of a badass as he possibly could. Still grieving my parents' death and overwhelmed with having to take over the family business, somehow I thought it would be a good idea to make John Luigi, who was still 16, my partner. Over the last 5 years, he'd been much more of a liability than an asset. But he was my brother and I loved him. And I still had hope that one way or another things were going to work out. A few minutes later, I smiled as I heard his big body lumbering up the steps and then down the hallway towards my office. No matter how much I tried, it was really hard to stay mad at him. But this wasn't a time for joking around. His temper had almost cost us something really important. And I needed to make sure that he understood that. He walked into my office with a sheepish grin. I looked him up and down. I still couldn't believe how damn big he was. I was only an inch or two taller than him, but he was definitely wider. He seemed to live in the gym. He'd never seen a heavy piece of iron that he didn't like. A silent tension reigned in the room. He was the first to speak. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I sighed and shook my head. I felt like grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking the shit out of him. But if I wanted to teach him how to control his emotions, then that's the kind of behavior that I needed to model for him. "John Luigi, you know everything's not all right. You really fucked up. Again." He lowered his head and looked away. "Don't get mad at me," I said. "I sent you there to do something really simple." He raised his head and stared at me. "Let's just say I have a different style of doing things. But it can be just as effective as yours." I took a few steps closer to him, my lips trembling with rage. He smirked. I swear to God I wanted to punch him right in his chiseled face. But I somehow gained control of my emotions. I turned my back to him and walked toward my desk. "Everything's just a big fucking joke to you," I said. "You just can't take anything seriously. Leonardo, I know I didn't do things exactly the way you wanted. And I'm sorry about that. But I'm not sorry about giving that old Chambers bastard a good ass kicking. It's exactly what he and everybody else in his family deserves. Furious, I spun towards him. But you almost killed him? I screamed. If I wanted to kill him, he would be dead. I knew exactly what I was doing. I sighed and turned away from him. Sometimes when I was talking to him, it felt like I might as well be talking to a brick wall. He was so damn hard-headed and stubborn. Well, I'm glad you're so confident in your abilities, I said. But I still have my doubts. Plenty of them. What's that supposed to mean? He snapped. It means that I'm going to need you to fall back for a bit. Until I wrap things up with Chambers. And when is that going to happen? A few days. I spent the next couple of hours alone in my office. I needed to set up a meeting with Chambers. Just the two of us. But as things stood, there was no way he would feel safe meeting me anywhere, especially not alone. And while I certainly didn't want to be alone with a bunch of his henchmen, I really had no other option. They would be crazy to try to hurt me. I was the only person who could help him. The only person who could get him out from under his $100 million debt. I was more than willing to help him. But it was going to cost him. More than he could ever imagine.
4. Caroline. After I left the hospital, I took the 6 train to Union Square. I was in a daze the entire time, trying to make sense of what was happening in my life. It felt like everything was about to change. Like my boring, safe, predictable life was about to be flipped upside down. I told my parents that I would do whatever they needed me to do to help them. And I meant it. Or at least I thought that I did. They seemed thankful but also a bit dismissive. Why should they believe that now, all of a sudden, I was actually going to try to be an asset, instead of a liability to the family? I didn't really know how to answer that question. When I walked out of the subway station, it felt good to find myself in the middle of a crowd moving back and forth, nobody paying any attention to me, nobody having any idea or caring who I was. A couple guys were standing outside the Hidden Bush bar, smoking cigarettes, laughing, and joking. They were cute, tall, and skinny like the guys that I'd always been around in undergrad and also in graduate school. They weren't my type. Not anymore. What was my type? At the moment I wasn't sure. And it really didn't matter. I had so many other things to worry about. Relations with the opposite sex just weren't a high priority at the moment. And they probably wouldn't be for some time into the future. I walked by the 2 boys without even a glance, heading into the dimly lit bar, hungry for the first of what I'm sure would be many drinks. For the first time in what seemed like hours, a smile broke across my face and a warm feeling spread throughout my body when I saw that head full of blonde hair at the bar. Samantha. It had been more than 4 years since we had last seen each other. But I felt like I could spot her from miles away. She radiated an unmistakable energy. She was flirting with a tall, muscular, tattooed, pony-tailed bartender. I smirked and shook my head. Yeah, she's always had a thing for the bad boys. And why not? She'd always been a bad girl. The one who was always willing to go to the edge and then over it if necessary. That attitude is what had nearly gotten her kicked out of our private high school. Luckily, her parents were very well connected. When I got to within a few feet of her bar stool, she turned, smiled, looked me up and down, and then hopped off the stool with her arms spread wide. "Oh my God," she said. "I missed you so much." We tightly embraced. "I really missed you too," I said, burying my head in her blonde hair which smelled like a mix of weed and cigarettes. I didn't mind that particular fragrance. Not at all. I just hoped that she had some left over for me. I wasn't really a fan of cigarettes, unless I was getting drunk, then I didn't mind having a puff or two. As for weed, I definitely enjoyed my fair share of it as an undergrad. But since coming back to Manhattan for graduate school, I hadn't bothered trying to get my hands on any. We finally sat down at the bar. I ordered a vodka tonic. Samantha ordered 2 shots of Jaeger and a draft beer. At her size, 5'4" and thin, you would have never guessed how much she could drink. But it had always been like this with her. Shots, beer, mixed drinks. She could go all night. On plenty of occasions in high school, I'd seen her outdrink some of the bigger, burlier football and rugby players. And there was no telling what pills or powders she had in her purse. But from the way she kept sniffing and wiping her nose, I definitely had an idea. You just couldn't stay away. Could you? she said, smiling. What do you mean? I asked. Manhattan. The big city. The bright lights. The 24/7 craziness. I knew that some small town in Ohio was never going to be enough to satisfy you. I sighed and looked down into my drink. Maybe you're right, I replied. But I've always wanted to go to Parsons. Ever since I was a little girl. Yeah, but I'm sure you could have found another design school to go to if you really wanted to. And I think I might have missed my family, I said, surprised that those words had come out of my mouth. What? She said a bit too loudly. The hunky bartender turned towards us with an eyebrow raised. I lowered my eyes and took a long, slow sip of my drink. By the time I was done, he had turned around and headed to the other side of the bar. That was a relief. For some reason, the idea of a stranger listening to me complain about my life really bothered me. Are you kidding? Samantha said. I thought you wanted more than anything to get away from the family business. To never walk by another building with the name Chambers Realty and Company on it. That's all you talked about for the last year in high school. My face flushed red with shame. I looked away. The image of my father in the hospital bed flashed in my mind. What a spoiled, entitled, bratty little bitch I'd been. So fucking ungrateful. Yeah, I know, I said, unable to face her. But it's different now. What is? She asked. Everything, I said. Today in the hospital when I saw my father there I just couldn't. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Your dad's in the hospital? Did he have a stroke? A heart attack? Her eyes grew wide with compassion and worry. I shook my head from side to side. No, he was attacked. Apparently, it has to do with this rivalry that my family has had with another family. Is it about money? It's about a lot of things. Money, power, prestige, revenge. At least that's what I think. I've never paid much attention to it. Until today. Until I saw my father in that hospital bed. What's the name of the family? She asked. I wiped away a tear, then took a few sips from my drink. The Antonellis, I said. As in Leonardo and Gianluigi Antonelli? As in Antonelli Realty and Company? I hadn't heard those two names before, so I wasn't sure how to respond. But the business name was familiar enough. Yes, I answered. I think that's the one. You know them? Caroline, fucking everybody knows them.
5. Leonardo. I turned right down a dead-end street. When I got to the end of it, I swung the car around. This would give me a good view. I was all alone. This definitely wasn't the best idea in the world. I could have called Gianluigi. I could have had him and his goons positioned all around the street, keeping an eye on it a couple of hours before the meeting. But since I couldn't trust them to keep their cool, I decided that I would just do this alone. I was in the Chelsea Piers section of the city. I could smell the salty scent coming off the Hudson River just behind me. The more I thought about it, the worse this idea seemed. What if Chambers really had no interest in talking to me? What if all he wanted was revenge? They could put a bullet in my head, drag my body about 20 feet and then throw me over the railing. I would end up swimming and eventually sinking with the fish. It would be a fitting end for someone in my line of work. All the tabloid newspapers would run with it. The TV stations would be talking about it. And it wouldn't take long for the true crime podcast to pick up the story as well. I doubted there would be much sympathy for me. Most likely they would bring up all the crimes that I'd been suspected of over the years: murder, extortion, bribery, kidnapping, and a few others. But then someone would have to mention that I'd never been convicted of anything and had never done more than a few hours in jail. With my team of lawyers and connections throughout the city, I could have whacked somebody in broad daylight, in front of 1,000 witnesses, and still gotten off. It was an intoxicating feeling. A dangerous feeling. And it was something that had caused me to be a bit too reckless at times. And maybe today was one of those times. I had 2 Glocks holstered on my hips and a knife down by my ankle. I wasn't interested in engaging in any sort of violence. But that didn't mean I wasn't fully prepared to do so. I looked up as I heard the sound of tires turning down the alley. 3 cars came towards me. A black Tesla followed by 2 black SUVs. I could feel the adrenaline surging in my veins. The cars continued coming down the alley, eventually stopping about 15 feet away from my car. I kept my hands close by my sides, ready to draw both my weapons if necessary. Ready to kill as many of those bastards in the Chambers gang as necessary. It would be exactly what they deserved. They were no strangers to bloodshed. And neither were we. One of the Tesla doors opened. A big man in a dark suit and dark shades got out. He walked around to the other side and opened the door. I held my breath. I wasn't sure what to expect. Moments later, a frail-looking man emerged from the car. He had a bandage around his head and one of his arms was in a sling. He walked toward me using a cane. The big, burly bodyguard walked next to him, providing him with some much-needed support. "Shit," I said under my breath. They really beat the crap out of the old man. Even though I hated Chambers, I still didn't like seeing him so broken and bruised. But this wasn't the time for sympathy. It was the time to be my cold, ruthless self. Chambers wouldn't expect anything less. And of course, I didn't want to disappoint him. "You're looking good," I said, as he got within a few feet of me. "You must be on a new workout program." He mumbled something under his breath, his lips quivering with rage. Then he stared at me with defiance and hatred. "You got a lot of balls coming here alone, Antonelli," he said. "What the fuck do you want?" I kept my hands by my sides, ready for whatever tricks the old man had up his sleeve. Sure, he was badly bruised. But I could tell that he still had plenty of fight left in him. I had him in a terrible position. Right where I wanted him? But I knew better than to let my guard down. And of course, I would have to keep my eye on those two SUVs that were about 30 feet away from me. The windows were tinted. I couldn't see how many people were inside. But I was certain that they were heavily armed. "Let's cut the bullshit," I said. "We both know you've got big problems. Much bigger than the beating that you took the other day from my men." "Well, it's nice to know that you're worried about me, Antonelli. That really warms my heart." After he finished speaking, he spat with disgust. I clenched my jaw. I was starting to understand why John Luigi wasn't able to control his temper the other day. There was something about this old man that made you want to strangle him. "I want to be the first to inform you," I said, "that you won't be getting the Brighton Yards deal." The old man's eyes opened wide with shock. "What the hell are you talking about? Did you get it?" I smirked and shook my head. "Nope, it's not us. It's the Saudi group. Everything was signed months ago." "That's not possible," the old man said, pain choking his voice. "We've been negotiating with the city for the last few months." I shook my head again. "That's all been a charade. They had to make it seem like it was a fair and open process. But you know how it goes. Don't you?" The old man looked away and mumbled under his breath. I knew that he must have been hurting. He had been staking so much on that deal. It could have turned everything around for him. "I wouldn't worry about that too much though," I said. "That deal is overhyped. Looks more like a money pit than anything else." He snickered. "That deal was going to save me." "It was." He suddenly stopped talking, realizing that he was revealing too much information. I smiled. "Don't worry, Chambers, I know all about it. $100 million debt that goes up every day. And let me guess, you want to help me. Right? I don't think you have a lot of options. So it would be a good idea to strongly consider my offer." I spent the next 10 minutes laying out my proposal. He listened to me in silence, his mouth gaping open. He couldn't believe what I was asking him. In almost any other circumstance, he would have angrily charged at me, wanting to strangle me for even having the audacity to make him such an offer. But at the moment, he didn't have a whole lot of options. Actually, he only had two. Death or prison. And of course, he didn't want either of those. I knew that he was enough of a selfish bastard to take my offer seriously. After I finished talking, we stared at each other. His bodyguard had retreated back to the car. It was just the two of us. The old man looked like he was going to fall over. I reached out to hold him up. He quickly pushed my arm away. My first instinct was to grab him by the back of the neck. But I managed to contain myself, clenching my fists and grinding my teeth. "Are you serious?" he asked. "If I give you my daughter, you will pay off my debt? All of it?" "I didn't come here to joke around. What do you think of the offer?" "I don't know whether you're crazy or just have really big balls. Listen, Chambers. There's not going to be a better deal out there for you than this." He shook his head in disgust. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. I knew that he wanted to do the deal. It was far too good for him to pass up. And from what I understood, his relationship had never been that great with his daughter anyway. "You're 100% sure about the Brighton Yards deal?" he asked. "I've got no chance?" Nope. It's a done deal. 500 million and she's yours, he said without hesitation. That's a hell of a lot of money, I replied. I'm not sure if she's worth it. His lips quivered furiously. He definitely wanted to hit me. It must have been killing him to have to negotiate with me over his own flesh and blood. She's worth every penny of it, you fucking bastard. Deal or no deal? I spent the next couple of hours driving around the city, aimlessly. I almost couldn't believe it was real. The old man was going to hand his daughter over to me. A 22-year-old, virgin. Pure, untouched. And she was going to be mine, all mine. She would have no one to run to. Her own father had sold her to me. What kind of man would do such a thing? A Chambers man. That's what kind. An Antonelli would never do something like that. It was so despicable. I would have to guard her very carefully. I was certain that at some point the old man would have second thoughts. Maybe his wife would push him into trying to get her back. With all the money I was handing over to him, he would be able to hire his own private SWAT team. But those were consequences I didn't want to think about right then. All that was on my mind was the conquest. And the day when it would truly be consecrated, when I would have her in my bed, on her back submitting to me, taking my cock deep inside of her tight, virgin pussy, as I pumped and pounded in and out of her, and she screamed and clawed her fingers into my back, begging me to fuck her harder and deeper, as her pussy dripped all over my cock, her virginal juices spilling onto the bed, our bodies cleaving to one another. I sighed, closed my eyes, reached down, and squeezed my hard cock. It was throbbing. It was begging to be in between her legs. I wondered if her eyes would grow wide and her mouth would gape open when she saw it, like all the other women. I wondered if she would tell me that it was too big and that there was no way it was gonna fit. I would smile and kiss her gently on the lips, nibbling on her earlobe, whispering to her that everything was going to be all right, moving my hands between her legs, and dipping my fingers into her dripping wet pussy, knowing that any pain she felt would be quickly replaced by a pleasure that she could have never imagined possible.
6. Caroline. I paced back and forth in my room. I felt like I was going crazy. I hadn't been able to leave the house for the past 3 days. My parents kept insisting that it was too dangerous. I was beginning to feel really stupid for having come back to New York City. I should have stayed away. Should have gone to the West Coast. There were plenty of design schools out there. I was beginning to feel like I had less freedom and less control over my life than when I was in high school. It was horrible. I wasn't going to be able to tolerate this much longer. Was there some way that I could have snuck out of the mansion and gotten a little taste of fresh air and freedom? Not unless I found a way to get around the 20 heavily armed guards that surrounded the place. And of course, that included 2 snipers on the roof. I wanted to help my parents. I really did. But I just didn't think I was cut out for this type of life. I knew that I owed them everything. I just wished there was some way to show my gratitude, some way to pay them back without having to be dragged into this dirty, underground criminal world. I sighed and plopped down on my bed. My head slumped in between my shoulders. Samantha had texted me a few times over the last couple of days, but I hadn't responded. I didn't feel like talking to her or to anyone else. But being in this room alone couldn't possibly be good for my mental health. Why wouldn't my parents allow me to take a walk with some of the guards? Who would be crazy enough to attack me if I was heavily protected? 2 knocks on the door brought me back to the present moment. My eyes lit up. Maybe it was over. Maybe the attackers had been caught and now I could go back to my regular life. That was all I wanted. These 3 days of confinement had made me appreciate my freedom more than I ever could have imagined. I rushed to the door, my body full of enthusiasm and hope. But when I opened it, all of those joyful emotions drained away. The tall, rail-thin butler towered over me with a grim expression in his eyes. "Hi Gregory," I said. "Can I go outside now?" "Your father wishes to see you in his office, Miss Chambers," he said before turning and walking down the hallway. I wanted to say something. To ask him for any sort of information. But my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth. My throat tightened. I had a strong feeling that things weren't going to work out well. My father's office was one of my least favorite places in the mansion. He always seemed mad when he was in there. But maybe that was just the nature of his business. He had to be ruthless because everybody else was. I knocked on the large mahogany door of my father's home office. I couldn't hear any noise coming from inside. That was a surprise. He was usually on the phone with someone. I knocked again. "Come in, damn it," he shouted, sending a shiver down my spine. All I wanted to do was turn around, run back to my room, and lock the door. But it was too late now. When Michael Chambers gave an order, it had to be obeyed. It had always been like that. And I didn't anticipate that changing any time soon. No matter how badly beaten and bruised he was, there was still plenty of life and fight in him. Yet I was concerned about how he was going to pay back his exorbitant debt. Would he have to sell some part of the company? Liquidate some of his assets? I had no idea what he was going to do. I pushed the door open and nearly fell over. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a young man, tall with wide shoulders, a chiseled jaw, and piercing brown eyes staring down at me. He had the most triumphant, arrogant grin I've ever seen. I instantly hated him. Now I definitely felt like turning around and running out of my father's office. Why hadn't he warned me that we wouldn't be alone? What was going on? I took a few steps back from the dangerous stranger. I crossed my arms against my chest. Then I looked at my father. There was a sad look in his eyes which contrasted sharply with how the stranger looked. "Caroline, there's someone I want you to meet," my father said. The man, who towered over me by almost 8 inches, slowly walked in my direction, his eyes fixed on me, the smile disappearing from his face. He seemed deadly serious. And he seemed so comfortable in my father's office. Yet I had never seen him before. Who could he possibly be? I could feel my knees trembling. I could also feel the tingling between my legs. No, it wasn't possible. I couldn't be attracted to this man. He wasn't the type of man that I would want anything to do with. "My name is Leonardo Antonelli," he said, not waiting for my father to complete the introduction. "And I'm here to claim what is rightfully mine." He turned his back to me and walked to the other side of the room, sat down in the chair, crossed his legs, then pulled a cigar out of his jacket pocket. My eyes shifted back and forth, from him to my father, like I was watching a tennis match, back and forth, trying to figure out what was going on. It was my father's turn to respond. But he sat there with a dumb expression on his face. As if all of a sudden he had forgotten how to speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out and demand answers. But I was unable to formulate any words. A million different confusing and conflicting thoughts raced through my mind. What had those words meant? He was here to claim what was his? And what could that possibly be? "As I told you the other day, I'm up to my neck in debt," my father said. "If I don't do something about it soon, I'm either going to end up in prison or..." His words cut off and he turned away from me. The sexy stranger from the notorious Antonelli family brought a bright orange flame to the end of his cigar. My eyes were riveted on him as he puffed out large clouds of fragrant smoke. I'd never seen my father smoke. And I knew that he would often complain about having to go to cigar clubs to close certain business deals. So why the hell was he letting this man, from a rival and hated family, smoke in here? Something very strange was going on. "Let's get to it, Chambers," Antonelli said. "There's no point dragging this out any longer. She's going to have to know sooner or later." "Know what?" I asked without hesitating. "Dad? What's going on?" My father sighed heavily, then he rose from his chair, grimacing. He grabbed his cane and slowly came toward me. He was only a few feet away, but it felt like it would take him an eternity to actually reach me. I stood rooted to the spot. He put a hand on my shoulder and stared deeply into my eyes. "Caroline, my lovely daughter, my only child, I'm terribly sorry. And I hope that one day you will be able to forgive me." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. For a few moments, there was silence as my father continued to stare at me, trying to communicate something, but I had no idea what it was. I wanted to speak, but I couldn't form any words. Antonelli towered over me, staring down. I couldn't believe how fucking big he was. It wouldn't have taken much effort for him to crush me, subdue me, and completely dominate me. My legs trembled. My pussy tingled. Why was this happening? I was terrified but also turned on. I didn't know this man. But I already hated him. The next 20 minutes seemed to happen in a blur. I could hardly make sense of the words that were being spoken. Before I knew it, I was sitting in a chair at my father's desk. A ballpoint pen was pushed into my hand and a long contract was laid out in front of me. I didn't need to read it. All I needed to do was to sign my name at the bottom of each page. I managed to glimpse a few phrases which caused me to shake and tremble. $200 million. Renouncement of the family name. Property of Leonardo Antonelli. When I finished signing each of the sheets, my father pulled the contract away. As he flipped through it to make sure that I had signed on every page, I could see a smile begin to light up his face. I could see the greed and satisfaction in his eyes. My mouth gaped open. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. My own flesh and blood. Could this possibly be real? He was actually selling me like I was a piece of property, and he wasn't selling me to just anybody. He was putting me into the hands of the family that he had always hated, that his father and grandfather had hated. "All right, it's time to end this little gathering," Antonelli said. "Why don't you say your goodbyes and then I can take my new possession home with me where she belongs?" My father's eyes were still focused on the contract. He must have been thinking about all the money he was going to spend once he had taken care of his debt. Maybe he was going to buy a new boat, a new car, or an island somewhere in the Caribbean. Just thinking about it made me sick. Before he had a chance to react and offer any more condolences or apologies, I stood up from the chair and turned my back on him, staring into the eyes of the man who was now in complete control of me. My master. My owner. Leonardo Antonelli. "I have no more to say to that man," I said, my voice quivering, quickly wiping my eyes. "He sold me. He has no more claims on me. I am no longer a Chambers. I'm an Antonelli now. Do whatever you want to me and please don't spare me any of your hatred. I know the pain that your family has experienced for generations. I want you to make me feel a pain 100 times worse than that. I want you to do whatever you want to me, but I beg that you do it roughly and without compassion. I will be yours, and yours completely, as long as you promise to never spare me any of your anger. I want you to punish me until you are certain that I am completely yours. I want you to turn me into your slut, your dirty, filthy, submissive whore."
7. Leonardo. Later that evening I sat in my office, a glass of scotch in one hand, and an unlit cigar in the other. I was still trying to make sense of the afternoon's events. Everything had been going so smoothly. I felt like I was completely in control of the situation and I knew exactly how I was going to manage my new piece of property. But then she had given her defiant soliloquy, literally and metaphorically turning her back on her father, renouncing her family name, declaring herself an Antonelli. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. And neither had that old bastard Chambers. The glee and greed that had glowed in his eyes as he stared at the signed contract, quickly went away as he heard his daughter proudly announcing that she wanted to be my whore. And that she wanted me to punish her for all the evil that the Chambers had done to my family over the years. I had to admit that I found that part to be a bit much. Yes, the Chambers had been evil bastards for the last several generations, spilling gallons of blood in their pursuit of power and profit, causing an innumerable amount of funerals. All that was true. But I would have to let her know that the Antonellis had not just stood around and been victims. We hadn't been lambs led to the slaughter. We had shed plenty of blood ourselves. Had caused plenty of funerals? But no matter how ruthless and sadistic we could be, we would always have one thing that the Chambers could never have. Honor. No Antonelli man would ever sell his daughter, no matter the price, to another family, let alone a rival family. The word would eventually get out. And once it did, I didn't see how people would continue respecting Chambers. Doors would be closed in his face. His buildings would be vandalized, sabotaged, maybe even burned down. When I first formulated this crazy plan, I had a feeling that it would work. I'd offered 100 million. He'd asked for 500. I counter-offered with 200. He reached out for my hand and enthusiastically shook it, licking his lips, his eyes gleaming with pleasure. That was the type of man he was. It was sickening. Disgusting. I would definitely have to punish Caroline just for the fact that she was the product of such a man's loins. There was a knock on my door. "Come in, Wilson," I said. "I've been waiting for you." My head security man came into my office with a grim expression on his face. I smirked. I knew that he didn't like this idea. Not one bit. And he was probably going to try to convince me how foolish I was being. Was probably going to tell me that I needed to get rid of that young woman ASAP. That she was going to bring me nothing but trouble. "There's no need to hold back," I said. "I can see you've got a lot on your mind." He sighed and shook his head. "Sir, the young woman is currently being washed and thoroughly cleaned. Our medical team will begin their inspections in about 15 minutes. Once that is complete, she will be taken to the holding room. At that point, We will await further instructions from you. That's very good, Wilson. But I want you to tell me what you think. You seem like you have a million thoughts swirling around in your mind. Tell me how foolish I'm being. Tell me how I'm risking my empire for that young piece of flesh. Tell me how I need to let go of this hatred of the Chambers. That it will only bring me to ruin. Sir, I've been with your family for almost 30 years. Since before you were born. My hatred for the Chambers runs deep. But there is something that I find troubling about this young woman. What? She's too compliant, sir, he said. She hasn't put up the slightest bit of resistance. And that's a bad thing? I asked. You don't think that I am capable of having that sort of effect on a woman? He sighed again. I know that you have quite a way with the ladies, sir. But something about this just seems off. Maybe it's just my prejudice. But I will never trust a Chambers. I don't care how forcefully she said that she renounced that name. It's in her blood. And it always will be. I took a long slow sip of my drink and pondered Wilson's words. If it was all an act, then I had to admit she was doing a damn good job. And she had me completely fooled. Everything she said in her father's office had seemed real to me, a bit melodramatic maybe, but it definitely seemed that it had come from somewhere deep within her. And the look on her father's face when she said those words had seemed real as well. Thank you for your counsel, Wilson. I will be sure to keep your words in mind over the next few days. If she's acting and this is all a ruse, then we need to get to the bottom of it as quickly as possible. Please keep tight 24-hour surveillance on Chambers and his most trusted associates. He smiled and nodded up and down. It would be my pleasure, sir. After Wilson left, I poured myself another glass of scotch and finally lit my cigar. I wasn't sure whether or not I should go down to the holding room and pay my new possession a visit. Wilson's words rattled in my head. Maybe I was being a fool. Walking right into a trap. Letting my ego, desire, and lust overpower my reason. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. She seemed so broken, so hungry for love and affection that it was easy for me to believe that she would be willing to be my whore, and whatever else I demanded of her. My cock throbbed. I couldn't wait to shove it down her throat, to watch her eyes bulge as I pushed it into the back of her mouth, making her gag and choke, letting her know who was in charge, who was her master. And of course, I would make her call me daddy, as the spittle and slobber dribbled out of her mouth. I couldn't wait to dominate her, to make her feel that she was completely worthless. I was going to defile her. Completely break her spirit. And she would consent to every filthy act that I demanded of her. She would beg and plead for more and more. She would cry out for me to be rougher, nastier, and more sadistic. I would break her down until she believed that no other man would ever want to touch her. She would be ruined, unable to feel any emotion unless she was being pushed past her limits, choked, slapped, gagged, spanked, tied up, and whipped. I would break her down and then slowly build her up. I would continue building her up until she was truly worthy of the name Antonelli. In front of her father, she had declared herself one of ours. But that wasn't true yet. She wasn't worthy to carry that name. I would have to punish her for being so presumptuous. All her life she had probably been a spoiled, bratty, entitled bitch. Well, that wasn't going to cut it in this family. I would only accept 100% submission. What an intoxicating feeling. I felt like my cock was going to explode. Yes, I would definitely be paying her a visit tonight.
8. Caroline. I was starting to get second thoughts. I wasn't sure how long I was going to be able to deal with this treatment. I was sitting in a small, cold room with a linoleum floor and bare walls. It smelled like a disinfectant as if it had just been cleaned. Something about that wasn't very reassuring. Had there been other people in here before me? Where did they end up? Where would I end up? They had stripped off all my clothes and taken all my belongings from me. I was wearing nothing but a robe, socks, and slippers. I was on the floor, my back up against the wall, my hands wrapped around my knees which I pulled into my chest. This was terrifying. I don't know why I'd gone along with my father's plan. The night before the office meeting with Antonelli, he had come to my room and given me the instructions. Everything's going to work out just fine, he said. You won't be in that vile house for more than a week. We're going to rescue you as soon as we possibly can. I desperately wanted to believe him, but I definitely had my reservations. He said that this is what I needed to do to save the family. I probably shouldn't have gone along with it. But I felt so guilty after seeing him in that hospital bed, knowing all the risks and sacrifices that he had taken to provide me with a life that most people would have killed for. As an undergrad, I had taken a couple of acting classes, so I knew how to get into a role and make myself believe that I was truly experiencing something. Those classes had taught me how to tap into deeply repressed emotions. And I guess that's where my speech had come from, the whole thing about wanting to be his slut and whore and all the other crap I had blurted out. How embarrassing. The idea of letting that sick, sadistic, evil but incredibly sexy man put his hands on my body disgusted me. I would never let that happen. I would never allow an Antonelli, the sworn enemies of my family, to defile me. That would bring dishonor to my entire bloodline. I had a mission to accomplish. I had told my parents that I would do anything to help them. I needed to be true to my word. But even as I thought about it, I couldn't help imagining what it would be like to actually submit to that man, to let him take control of me, to let him do whatever it was he wanted to do to me, no matter how twisted and wicked, no matter how vile and foul. What would it be like to let go, to allow a dominant, muscular, aggressive, alpha male to have his way with me? As I sat on that cold linoleum floor, all alone in a room with no windows or lights, I could feel a tingling sensation emanating from between my legs and spreading throughout my body. I closed my eyes and moaned while rubbing the insides of my thighs, my fingers moving closer and closer to my pussy. Oh my God, I moaned, dipping a finger into the wetness of my desire. This couldn't be real. There was no way that I could actually be this turned on. I began slowly strumming and stroking my engorged clit. I imagined that he was standing over me, undoing his belt buckle, pulling his zipper down, reaching into his boxers, and pulling out the biggest, fattest, juiciest, most delicious cock that I'd ever seen. No, 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 I said out loud. This couldn't be happening. It was a bad dream. A nightmare. I pulled my hand away from my pussy, disgusted with myself. I wiped the wetness on the robe and shook my head back and forth, wiping the tears from my eyes. I wasn't going to be able to handle this much longer. I was going to break. To give in to the filthy, disloyal desires that raged within me. Daddy. Where are you? Help me.
9. Leonardo. The only light in the room came from the monitors on the wall. This was one of the several security rooms that I had in the mansion. From here, I was able to observe different parts of my domicile. But there was really only one monitor that I'd been watching for the last half an hour, my eyes riveted on that shivering, delicate piece of property which was now all mine. I was trying to take heed of Wilson's words. He didn't trust the girl. Didn't trust the Chambers. That was understandable. But he hadn't been in that office with me when she made her speech. Even if she was acting, there was something real about what she had said. She wanted to submit to me. I knew she did. But now I needed to observe her when she thought that she was all alone and no one was looking. What would she do? For about 20 minutes she hardly moved. Just sat with her back pressed up against the wall and her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, shivering. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost felt like going down there, picking her up, and carrying her in my arms to a warm bedroom, tucking her under the covers, kissing her on the forehead, and wishing her a good night. But this wasn't the time to be soft and sentimental. This wasn't the time to be kind and warm-hearted. This woman was still my sworn enemy. Her blood was evil. It was tainted. It was cursed. I had to be very careful. Suddenly, she moved, spread her legs, put her hands in between them, and began rubbing her thighs. Wow! I couldn't believe what I was watching. I wish I had installed audio recording down there. I would have loved to listen to her moan, to listen to her talk to herself as she played out her fantasy. But unfortunately, I could only watch her. I zoomed in and yes, her fingers were creeping up towards her pussy. I undid my belt buckle, and reached into my boxers, squeezing my hard, long, thick dick. I looked down and stared at it with an arrogant grin. What a beautiful piece of man meat. A huge vein ran down the middle and smaller veins snaked up and down the sides. I could hardly wait for the first time that I would have an opportunity to pull it out and show it to her. I couldn't wait to see the look in her eyes. Wilson had been able to confirm with 100% certainty that yes, in fact she was a virgin. But that didn't mean that she'd never seen a man's dick up close and personal before. Whatever the case, I knew that she'd never seen one like mine. I put my focus back on the screen. She was definitely playing with herself, mouth half open, eyes closed. I began stroking my dick up and down, back and forth. It was so tingly and sensitive. It felt like it was going to explode any second, shooting thick globs of cum into the air. I couldn't remember the last time that I'd masturbated. It had been so long. Whenever an insatiable sexual urge took hold of me, I would send an end-to-end encrypted text to the most exclusive escort service in the city. They would tell me what was on the menu for that day. And I would quickly make my decision. The whore would arrive within 20 minutes. And I always made sure that they never spent more than an hour inside of my mansion. And I also made sure never to hire the same girl twice. The last thing that I needed was them catching any sort of feelings, thinking that they'd be able to come into my life as anything more than a warm and wet receptacle for my throbbing cock. So far in my life, that's all women had been for me. Fuck dolls whose only purpose was to open their mouths, legs, and asses for my hard cock. I didn't want to hear about their thoughts and dreams, their hopes and aspirations, their favorite food, color, or animal. I didn't give a shit about any of that. Maybe I would eventually meet a woman that would be more to me than just a fuck toy. But I didn't anticipate that happening anytime soon. I was far too cold and cynical for anything like love. It seemed like such a stupid emotion. Getting attached to something that you could never truly control. Something that could be ripped from you at any moment. That was the kind of thing that women and beta males went around worrying about. It made me sick just thinking about it. As much as I hated the chambers, or maybe because I hated them so much, I was very much looking forward to deflowering that untouched, 22-year-old, virgin pussy. A big, thick, Antonelli cock would be the first to ever penetrate her, the first to make her scream and holler, the first to make her tremble, the first to make those virginal fluids leak from her. Just thinking about it was making me crazy. I wasn't going to be able to resist for much longer. My eyes went back to the screen. She'd stopped masturbating. Had she already come? I wasn't sure. And then I saw her leaning over, losing balance. Her head smacked against the linoleum floor. I zoomed in even tighter on her. Her eyes were shut. Something was wrong. Had she passed out? What the fuck? I sprung out of the seat, quickly stuffed my cock back into my boxers, pulled up the zipper, and buckled my belt. I had to get down there. Wilson, get Dr. Reynolds over here ASAP. I yelled into the phone. Emergency. I took the elevator down to the basement. Adrenaline surged through my body. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. Maybe she was just dehydrated. Maybe the stress of the last 48 hours had gotten to her. But it was still my fault. I should have made sure that her physical and mental state were where they needed to be. If there was something truly wrong with her, I would feel incredibly guilty. She was my property. That meant that it was my responsibility to take care of her, just like any other of my possessions. Boiling with rage, I banged my fists against the walls of the elevator. Finally, it arrived in the basement and the doors opened. I sprinted down the hallway to the holding room. I frantically entered the security code. Her slim, pale, virginal body lay on the floor. She wasn't moving. I couldn't hear her breathing. I hovered over her for a few seconds, not sure what to do. But then I got down on my knees and grabbed her wrist to check her pulse. I couldn't feel one. Then I touched her neck, hoping that I would feel something there. Nothing. Fuck. I yelled, shaking her several times. Caroline. Wake up. Wake the fuck up. Her lifeless body was like a rag doll in my hands. I was going to have to do something. Whatever was wrong with her, she wasn't going to make it. By the time the doctor got here, it would be too late. I put her limp body gently back on the floor. I took a deep breath, the deepest breath I'd ever taken in my life, and then put my mouth over hers and breathed into her, our lips pressing against each other for the first time. Then I pumped her chest, not really sure what the hell I was doing, but too desperate to worry about whether my technique was right or not. I was going to do everything in my power to keep this young, pure soul alive. It wasn't her fault that she was born into that family of vile bastards. It wasn't her fault that her father was heartless, ruthless, and filled with greed, a man that was more than happy to sell his own flesh and blood if it meant saving his own ass. None of that was her fault. She had a long life ahead of her. And it was my responsibility to make sure that she got to live it. I took another deep breath, fixed my mouth to hers, and breathed into her, hoping that she would spring to life at any moment, hoping that I was doing this right and not just wasting my time. But nothing changed. I pumped on her chest again. Sweat dripped from my face onto her deliciously white flesh. Her eyes were still closed. Her body was still limp and motionless. I was getting more and more desperate. I had no idea what else I needed to do. If I didn't figure out something, and if I couldn't bring her back to consciousness, I would live with this guilt forever. Once again I took a deep breath, put my mouth on hers, and breathed as much life as possible into her body. Suddenly, her eyes opened. I couldn't believe it, so I kept on breathing into her. The next thing I knew, her hands were slapping my face and her nails were digging into my cheeks. "Get off of me!" she yelled. "You fucking asshole!" I had no choice but to roll off her. I got to my feet and quickly backed away from her. I touched my face and then looked at my fingers. I was bleeding. "That fucking bitch," I said to myself. She coughed and spit. She had a look of complete disgust on her face. "What the fuck were you doing?" she said. "You're even sicker than I thought." Her words stung me. But I wasn't sure why. I didn't give a shit about this entitled brat who'd never had to work for anything in her life. This stuck-up bitch who'd never done anything for anyone except herself. "That's one way to say thanks," I replied, snickering. "Thanks for what? For jamming your tongue down my throat while I was sleeping? You're disgusting. I saved your fucking life. You ungrateful." Before I could finish my sentence, Wilson and Dr. Reynolds burst into the room.
10. Caroline. My eyes followed Leonardo as he left the room. I felt like I had made a mistake. I wanted to apologize to him. But the words just wouldn't come out of my mouth. "Miss Chambers, you're very lucky to be alive," the gray-haired doctor said to me. "I don't know how we missed this during your initial assessment, but your blood pressure is dangerously low. We're going to move you to the ICU." "I have to go to the hospital?" I asked. "It's that serious?" "Yes, it's serious. But don't worry about the hospital. We have all the proper medical facilities right here in the mansion." The next thing I knew, I was on a stretcher being wheeled down a hallway and then pushed into a bright room with a bunch of different medical instruments. This was so strange. I had to shield my eyes from the light. A nurse wearing a face mask put the forth into my arm and told me to relax. I really didn't have any other choice. And then my mind began to wander back to what had happened before everything went black. I'd been sitting on the linoleum floor, my back pressed up against the wall, my arms pulling my knees up to my chest. I'd been hungry, tired, and angry. Worried that my father's plan wouldn't work. Worried that he would no longer care about my well-being, once he had the money in hand and all his debts had been paid off. And then I remembered what happened next. I had started thinking about Leonardo. What it would be like to have him standing over me, reaching into his boxers, pulling out a big, thick, fat delicious dick, shoving it into my mouth, making me choke and gag, putting his hands on the back of my head and forcing it down even deeper. I had never taken a man's dick in my pussy or in my mouth. I had given a couple of hand jobs, but those really weren't all that satisfying for me. At 22, and still a virgin in both those ways, I was beginning to think that maybe something was wrong with me. I didn't know how to really explain it, but none of the guys that I'd been around so far in my life inspired me to take that leap, to allow them to penetrate me in either of those ways. But there was something about Leonardo that was different from any of the men I'd ever encountered. And it was more than just the intense, primal sexual energy that emanated from him. There was a pain, a deep wound that I sensed he carried within him. I could see it in his eyes. In the way his jaw would clench with intense anger. I was supposed to hate him. I was supposed to be disgusted by the mere thought of him touching me. That's what I'd been taught. And that's probably why I reacted the way I did when he managed to revive me, bringing my limp, lifeless body back to life. Seeing him on top of me, feeling his mouth pressed against mine, I immediately thought that he was doing something evil, like trying to take advantage of me while I slept. As an undergrad, I'd heard plenty of stories of girls being taken advantage of like that. Guys would fill them with liquor or other drugs, leaving them unable to defend themselves. It had always been a nightmare of mine that I would lose my virginity like that. That some sick, twisted man would snatch it away from me. And that's probably why I reacted the way I did. But sitting here in this bed, with an 4 coming out of my arm, I felt terrible. Once again I'd been an ungrateful, entitled bitch. He could have just let me die. Easily disposed of my body and wiped his hands clean of this whole affair. I was a Chambers. He was an Antonelli. We were supposed to hate each other. We were supposed to celebrate each other's deaths. But that's not what he'd done. He had breathed life back into me. And I could see the hurt on his face, as he stood there bleeding when I accused him of trying to take advantage of me. That must have been a grave insult for a man like him, one of the last men that would ever need to take advantage of a woman. Most women would be more than willing to throw themselves at his feet, to do whatever he asked, to have his hands and his lips all over their bodies. I sighed and closed my eyes. I needed to see him. I needed to thank him. I wanted to kiss his lips. But I also wanted him to hold me in his arms. I wanted to cry like a little girl and rest my head on his chest. I wanted him to love me. No, no. This was crazy. I couldn't be having these thoughts. I was just being emotional. There's no way that I would feel like this tomorrow, once I got some rest and was properly hydrated. All these crazy thoughts would go away. And it would go back to being just what it was. We were from two rival families. A romantic relationship would never be possible. The only reason I was here was that my father had sold me to him. But my father would make good on his word. He was going to break me out of here by the end of the week. And then I would be able to go back to my normal, boring, entitled, spoiled life. I wouldn't be staying here much longer. Leonardo was never going to put his hands on me again. And he certainly wasn't going to be the man who took my virginity. No. That was not going to happen.
11. Leonardo. When I'd left the holding room, I'd been furious. I couldn't believe that she'd actually accused me of trying to take advantage of her while she was asleep or unconscious. The thought of doing something like that disgusted me. I had always felt that rapists should be castrated and paraded before the public to discourage that type of behavior in society. No matter how cold and ruthless I was, no matter the fact that she was a Chambers and I hated everything about her, I would never stoop so low to do something like that. After a couple glasses of scotch, I was finally able to calm down. I had to try to look at things from her perspective. This whole ordeal must have been unlike anything she'd ever experienced or even imagined. It was no wonder that her system had shut down. That was something that I probably should have considered as I was making the agreement with her shameless father. For the first few days, maybe even the first week, she would need to be under 24/7 medical surveillance. But I hadn't bothered to think about that. My brain had been so clouded with feelings of lust and revenge. I'd been so hungry to make her submit, to break her, to humiliate her, that I hadn't bothered to remember that she was a flesh and blood human being, meaning her life was fragile and could expire at any moment, just as it could happen to any of us. For maybe the first time in my life, I actually felt shame. I was embarrassed by the way I had conducted myself throughout this whole messy affair. I was starting to think that maybe I should have stayed out of Chambers' business. Let him go to prison or get stuffed in a ditch if he couldn't pay his debts. It wasn't my concern. I slammed my fist hard against the desk, grinding my teeth. This was the cost of hatred. It could gnaw at you, destroy you from the inside. And once it got hold of you, there was no way to break free. Hating Caroline made no sense. She had never done anything to me. Holding her responsible for the crimes of her forefathers was the height of folly. Unlike me, she wanted nothing to do with her family's dirty business. I had felt the same way before the sudden and tragic deaths of my parents. I wanted nothing to do with this. I wanted to go to school and build my own life, establish myself in Asia or Europe, far away from New York City, far away from all those buildings with my family's name on them. Someone like Caroline was probably one of the few people that would actually be able to understand me, to be able to understand what it was to live with the burden of such a legacy, the fear of letting down your parents, and ruining what had been built over generations. So many conflicting thoughts swirled in my mind. I should have tied her up by now, handcuffed her, and forced her to open her mouth as I pushed my cock deep into the back of her throat. I should have made her virgin pussy mine, pumping and pounding it as she screamed my name and begged me to fuck her harder and deeper, and I dutifully obliged. But all of a sudden, those feelings of insatiable lust weren't as strong as they should have been. I felt something else. Affection? Sympathy? Maybe even love? No. There was no way that was possible. How could I love her? That would be crazy. She was a Chambers. I was an Antonelli. Maybe I didn't have to hate her. But there was no way that I could love her. That would be making a mockery of everything my family had stood for. I would be a laughingstock in this city. But as much as I tried to explain away my feelings with reason, there was something in my gut telling me that she just might be the woman who would be able to understand me, who would want more than my muscles, my cock, my money, and prestige. Unlike the whores who I regularly ordered for delivery, she already had more than enough prestige and money. So I would never have to worry that she was using me for those things. She also understood what it was like to be raised by a cold, selfish, domineering father, which is exactly what my father had been before he passed. Was I overreacting in the wake of a medical emergency? Or were these genuine feelings?
12. Caroline. After about 12 hours in the ICU unit, I was finally moved to a bedroom somewhere in the mansion. I was laying in a queen-size bed in a room with bare, beige walls and several windows which looked out onto the property. The morning sunlight coming through the blinds woke me up. I had a massive headache. I rubbed the back of my head and noticed a big knot. For a moment I was worried. Was there something growing out of my skull? Then I remembered the nurse telling me that I had fallen and banged my head hard against the floor. That's what had caused the bump back there. When was I going to see Leonardo again? Was he still angry with me? And if so, what was he going to do to punish me? I still felt really bad about what I said to him before he'd stormed out of the holding room. I'd accused him of something horrible, without knowing what the hell I was talking about. I hadn't meant to hurt him. But that's probably what I'd done. I had to apologize as soon as possible. And maybe he wouldn't accept my apology. Maybe he would curse me out and call me all sorts of nasty names. That's what I deserved. But I hoped that he would be kind, gentle, and sweet with me. That's what I really wanted from him. There was only so much time that I was going to be able to spend alone. I needed some sort of contact with the outside world. There was a knock on the door. I sat up in the bed. Was it him? Was he finally coming to see me? A warm, exciting feeling spread throughout my body. The handle turned and the door opened. I sighed with disappointment. It was the nurse, the same one who had looked after me in the ICU room. She pushed a tray of food into the room. She kept her mask over her mouth as she talked to me. Here's some breakfast, Miss Chambers. Pancakes, bacon, and eggs. And this carafe is full of hot black coffee. And there's fresh milk and sugar here for you as well. The smell of the food made me feel a little bit better. I definitely wanted the coffee. Hopefully, it was strong. That was just what I needed to get my day started. I'll come back in about 20 minutes to take the trays, the nurse said. Do you need anything else? There was a strange look in her eye as if she were trying to communicate something to me. Was I supposed to ask for something else? Maybe inquire about where Leonardo was? I wasn't sure. I shook my head quickly from side to side. No. Thank you so much. This is perfect. I spent the next 15 minutes devouring the food, washing each mouthful of bacon and syrupy pancakes and eggs, down with the black coffee. I usually took my coffee with a little bit of milk and sugar. But I didn't want that now. I wanted to feel that rough, slightly bitter taste. I finished just about all the food, then sat back in the bed with a contented grin on my face. Maybe staying here wasn't going to be so bad after all. There was a knock on the door. I smiled, assuming it was the nurse coming to pick up the trays. I couldn't wait to tell her how delicious the food was. And to ask her to please give my regards to the chef. The door opened and something immediately caught my attention. This wasn't the same nurse. This woman was taller, slimmer, and had blonde hair. Her intense blue eyes glared at me above the face mask she was wearing. The food was really good, I said as she approached the trays. Are you the? Shut up and listen, she said, her voice cutting through me. There's been a slight change in plans. My mouth gaped open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Who was this woman? Why was she talking to me like this? What? I asked, dumbfounded. Your father's run into a bit of trouble.
13. Leonardo. While driving around Manhattan, trying to clear my mind, I couldn't help wondering about the next encounter I would have with Caroline. I usually never apologize for anything, but that's exactly what I had to do in this situation. I couldn't blame her for feeling the way she did. For thinking that maybe something perverse was going on when she came back to consciousness and found my mouth pressed up against hers. That was a crazy situation. A lot of people would have reacted like that. It wasn't something that I would hold against her. I knew that I really wasn't supposed to care about what she thought about me. Her thoughts weren't supposed to matter. She was my property. I could do whatever I wanted with her. But that's just not the way I felt. And I had to admit that to myself. I could feel deeper feelings stirring within me. This wasn't normal for me. It was scary. Terrifying, actually. But at the same time, it was exciting, as if I was embarking on some new adventure. For the last 24 hours, I just hadn't been able to keep my mind off her. I couldn't stop thinking about holding her lifeless body in my hands, her deliciously pale flesh, thin legs, long flowing, blonde hair, and soft, delicate blue eyes. Everything about her was in such stark contrast to my dark, brooding, masculinity. When I looked at her, I couldn't help feeling obligated to protect her. But this was crazy. There was no way that I could actually be having these thoughts. She was my sworn enemy. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and clenched my jaw. I wasn't used to dealing with conflicting emotions. Things in my life were simple. Black or white. I hated these gray areas. They made me feel very uncomfortable. The ringing of my phone snapped me back to reality. I was going to ignore the call, but when I saw Wilson's name on the screen, I knew that it would be best to pick it up. "Any news?" I asked, not really expecting that he'd uncovered any new information in the last couple of hours. "Sir, you haven't heard?" he said. I clenched my jaw even tighter. I hated questions like that. "Wilson, you're the person I pay to gather intel. What happened?" "Our friend Mr. Chambers has gone missing," he said. "Missing?" I replied. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means that nobody's seen him or his wife in the last 48 hours. "That's not a big deal," I replied. "The old bastard ran off with the money. What does that matter to us?" I couldn't blame Chambers for wanting to get out of New York City. Things were getting a bit too hot around here for him. It made sense that once he paid off the debt, he would want to use the remaining money, $100 million or so, to start over somewhere else. Or at least run his New York City businesses from a faraway location. That seemed reasonable to me. I probably would have done the same thing. But of course, I never would have put myself in such a position by racking up so much debt or by bringing shame to my family by selling my only child to my most hated rival. "Sir, the word on the street is that Chambers and his wife were abducted and killed." "What the fuck?" I said, skidding to a stop at a red light. A few pedestrians cursed at me as they walked past my car. Usually, I would have returned the insults and may have even gotten out. But Wilson's last words kept me stuck to the seat. "If he paid off his debts, why the hell would somebody want to kill him?" I asked. Wilson sighed. "We haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet, sir. But we're currently tapping into all of our sources." I could tell that Wilson was holding something back. That made me even more pissed. This man had been working for my family since before I was born. He knew how things worked as well as anybody. "Who's behind this?" I barked into the phone. "Who would want him dead?" "Sir, there are probably a lot of people who would want Chambers dead. But..." "Answer the fucking question." "The Caravaggios, sir." I smiled and shook my head. The Caravaggios had always been big-time players in the construction industry. Over the years, I'd heard plenty of stories about their willingness to use violence to get their way. But I'd always shrugged my shoulders with indifference. Compared to me, they were small time. Nothing to worry about. "We're going to have to figure this out," I said. "Is there anything else you have for me?" "Yes, sir." "What?" "They're coming for Caroline," he replied. "They want her dead."
14. Caroline. Before I had time to ask her what had happened to my father, the blonde nurse had turned her back on me and left the room. I spent the next 20 minutes in bed shivering, tears streaming down my cheeks. Just as I was enjoying some peace and contentment after finishing breakfast, this bad news had to be dropped on me. Did it mean that I was going to have to stay here longer? Had my father tricked me into believing that he was going to rescue me when he never had any such intention? That possibility hurt more than anything. He had used me. He didn't really give a shit about what happened to me one way or another. Didn't care what that violent, dangerous but incredibly sexy Antonelli was going to do with me when he got me alone. I was his only child. And he didn't care that I would suffer at the hands of his greatest rival. I still had my virginity intact, but that wasn't going to be the case for much longer. I could see it in Leonardo's eyes. He wanted to dominate me. Wanted to turn me into his personal whore. Wanted to feel my virginal fluids leaking out on his cock as I cried in pain and pleasure. That enemy cock would be the first to penetrate my tight, virgin pussy, and my father didn't even care. What a bastard. It made me sick just thinking about him. And thinking about my mother, who had never done anything except go along with whatever he said. I would never be like her. I felt like screaming. My chest was heaving. Sweat dripped from my forehead. I knew I needed to calm down. I still wasn't 100% healthy. The last thing I wanted was to go back into that ICU unit, to have another 4 put in my arm, and have all sorts of tests run on me. But this wasn't fair. What did I do to deserve this? Suddenly, the door opened and Leonardo's angry, suspicious face appeared before me. His eyes darted around the room. His presence made me tremble with fear and excitement. He was exactly the person that I wanted to see at this moment. At least that's what I thought. "Is someone else in here?" he asked, getting down on his knees and looking under the bed. He stomped around to the various closets, angrily opening them and furiously searching them. "Where are you, Caravaggio? You bastard. If you touch one hair on her head, I'll cut open your stomach and rip out your intestines." He stormed into the bathroom. What was he talking about? Caravaggio? I had never heard that name before. And what did it have to do with me? There were so many questions that I wanted to ask him. But he seemed so angry, so unhinged. I kept my mouth shut and continued shivering in the bed. He came out of the bathroom, his face covered in sweat, his eyes bulging out of his head. He looked like he was going to explode. I should have been terrified of him. And in part I was, but I was also really turned on. I could feel a tingling between my legs. This was a man that I could trust to protect me. Who would dare cross him? This was a man who would never sell me, let alone to his enemies. He also seemed like a man who would never put himself in a situation where he owed so much money as my father had. He radiated honor and virtue, even if it was the twisted, dark, mafia, underworld kind. He sat down on the bed and took a few moments to catch his breath. Then he turned to me with a grave expression in his eyes. I covered my mouth. My eyes opened wide with fear.
15. Leonardo. After hanging up with Wilson, I'd sped back to the mansion. The veins were bulging in my neck and forehead. I wasn't supposed to care about Caroline. I should have probably offered her up to the Caravaggio's for a hefty fee. That would have been the smart, rational, and reasonable thing to do. That would have been the cold, heartless, and ruthless thing to do. The kind of thing that I would have done a couple weeks ago, without even thinking about it. But now, something was different. Something within me had changed. Suddenly, I felt an intense, almost insane desire to protect her. I wouldn't let anyone touch her. She'd already been through enough. With her father and mother gone, wiped off the face of the earth, maybe sitting at the bottom of the ocean somewhere, she had no one to turn to. She was all alone. An orphan. If anything happened to her, I would be responsible. It was a tremendous burden on my shoulders. But I was going to fully embrace it. For once in my life, I might actually do something good for someone. For once in my life, I might actually do something without being inspired by gaining more power, prestige, or money. Was I getting soft? Or maybe just maturing? I wasn't sure. And I really didn't care. I quickly turned through the mansion gates, then came to a skidding stop in my driveway, hopped out of the car, and raced inside. I had to get up to that bedroom as soon as possible. The Caravaggios were coming for her. I was certain of that. How did they plan on getting their hands on her? We hadn't figured that out yet. But it wouldn't be long till we uncovered their diabolical plan. And hopefully, it wouldn't be too late. "Wilson." I yelled into my phone. "We're going on full lockdown immediately. You understand me? Nobody leaves the premises and nobody enters for the next 48 hours. I hung up the phone before he could reply. I didn't bother knocking on the bedroom door. She was a guest at my house. No, she wasn't a guest, she was my property. I didn't owe her that respect or courtesy. I burst into the room, my eyes darting around frantically. I sensed that someone else was in there. I sensed that the enemy had already breached the premises. I yelled at her, then got down on my knees, looking under the bed, then I got back to my feet, went around to the different closets, searching them up and down, top to bottom, then I went into the bathroom and came out, sweating, my chest heaving. My eyes must have been shooting fire at her. She sat in the bed, her knees pressed up against her chest, shivering. She looked terrified. I was sorry about that. But for the moment, there was nothing that I could do about it. She would have to understand that I was trying to protect her. Maybe I would be able to explain that to her once I calmed down. But right now there was too much adrenaline, too much anger and rage coursing through my veins for me to remain calm. I finally got a hold of my emotions, wiped the sweat from my brow, and sat down on the bed. I swallowed hard before I began speaking. I'd never had to tell anyone this sort of news before. The words were stuck in my throat. How do you tell someone, especially someone so young, so innocent, so pure, that their parents are gone? That now she's an orphan in this world? I couldn't help thinking back 5 years ago when I first got the news from Wilson that my father had been rushed to the hospital after suffering a heart attack. I thought for sure that he would pull through. But after a couple hours in the emergency room, I received the news that he had passed away. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. It hurt too much. There were so many things that I wanted to do to make him proud. More than anything, I wanted to show him that I was capable of building my own life, of making a name for myself, and that I didn't need all the things that I'd inherited. But I'd never gotten that chance. Before I could say anything, she raised her eyes to me, her lips quivering. "Did you do something to my father?" she asked. "Did you kill him? Please tell me the truth." Tears streamed down her cheeks. I clenched my jaw. Once again, she was accusing me of something that I hadn't done. My first instinct was to become angry. But this wasn't the time for that. I needed to keep a cool head. "No, Caroline," I said. "I promise you that I haven't done anything to your father. I despise him with every bone in my body. But we made a fair deal. And I'm a man of my word." She looked away, biting down on her bottom lip. I sensed that there was something she wanted to tell me, but was holding back. For a moment, I felt like grabbing her by the shoulders and violently shaking her until she spat it out. But I knew that wasn't the right approach. "Is there something you need to tell me?" I asked. With fear in her eyes, she shook her head from side to side. But I didn't believe her, not for a second. Furious, I grabbed her shoulders and held her firmly in place. "Tell me what you know."
16. Caroline. My heart was pounding. I'd never had a panic attack before, but I felt like I was on the verge of one. Leonardo's eyes seemed to bore a hole through my skull. I was terrified of telling him the truth. But I was also terrified of lying to him. He would see right through any deceit. "Tell me what you know," he screamed, his hands tightly gripping my shoulders, his lips trembling with rage. But what was I supposed to say? How would he react when I told him my father's plan, and that I'd been in on it from the beginning? But that now I was having second thoughts. I sighed heavily and wiped a few tears away. There was no point in delaying anymore. I was going to have to tell him one way or the other. If he wanted to punish me, then I would just have to take it. I deserved his wrath, his fury, his anger, his hatred. I deserved all of it. "You've got 5 seconds to start talking, you stuck-up, spoiled bitch," he said through clenched teeth. "And then I'm going to make you feel a pain that you've never even imagined." My body trembled. My pussy tingled. No man had ever talked to me like that before. I liked it. Really liked it. And suddenly I had an idea, one that would allow both of us to get what we wanted. I smiled and noticed immediately that the expression on his face changed. He seemed confused. Moments earlier he had my body quivering under his strong grip. But I figured out a way to turn the tables on him. I had no idea how he was going to react to my idea. But at this point, I didn't really care about the outcome. The thrill of this dangerous game was more than enough to satisfy me. "I promise to tell you everything I know," I said. "But first you have to do something for me." "Do something for you?" he screamed, his eyes shooting flames at me. His fingers dug deeper into my soft, pale flesh. I resisted the urge to wince in pain. Instead, I stared at him defiantly. "Who the fuck do you think you're talking to?" "I'm really not sure," I replied. But I thought that I was talking to a man who wanted to dominate me, who wanted to make me submit, who wanted to make me scream and squeal and cry out in pain. But now I'm not so sure. His eyes opened wide with shock. He took his hands off my shoulders, stood up, and turned his back to me. For what seemed like forever, but was probably only a minute, he paced around the room in silence. The tension was suffocating. I wasn't sure whether or not I had made the right decision. Maybe I was pushing things too far. Maybe I should just tell him. As I was about to open my mouth and blurt out everything I knew, he quickly came towards me and grabbed my arm, yanking me off the bed and to my feet. "Okay, you spoiled fucking brat. If you want to play games, then we'll go down to the dungeon and play. Yes, please take me down there. Do whatever you want to me and I'll tell you everything." He looked away, shook his head, and mumbled something under his breath. I couldn't tell whether he was surprised, disgusted, or angry. Or maybe a mix of all three emotions. I smiled triumphantly. I was finally going to get the punishment that I deserved.
17. Leonardo. I'm not sure what came over me. But when she looked at me with that stupid grin, I just couldn't control myself. I had no idea what I was going to do to her once we got down to the basement. I had one hand firmly wrapped around her neck as I pushed her into the elevator. She was breathing heavily. I was tempted to turn her around so I could look into her eyes, so I could see the fear or lust or whatever else. But I decided against that. I didn't want her to see my face. I was excited but also worried. Worried that I may take things too far. Worried that I might not push things far enough. I wasn't sure what would be worse. Being too rough. Or too gentle. We finally got down to the basement. The elevator doors opened. I removed my hand from the back of her neck and spun her around. We stared into each other's eyes. Her lips were half open. Her eyes were wide. Her pupils were dilated and full of desire. I looked her up and down. She was wearing nothing but a white robe and slippers. I hungered for her soft, pure, pale flesh. I slowly undid the belt of the robe. Then I reached between her legs. She moaned, threw her head back, and closed her eyes. I gently rubbed her pussy lips, which were wet with lust. And then I moved my fingers up and gently strummed her clit. "Oh, that's so good," she said. "Don't stop. Please, don't stop." But that's exactly what I did. I stopped. Then grabbed her neck and forced her to suck on the two fingers, which were coated with her desire. She hungrily did so. I pushed them in and out of her mouth, and then I grabbed her throat. "Open your fucking eyes," I said. She obeyed. "Don't you ever tell me what to do. Do you understand? Good." I picked her up, threw her naked body over my shoulder, and exited the elevator, heading down the basement hallway toward the dungeon. I put the key in the large metal door and pushed it open with my shoulder. I clicked on the lights and a smile lit up my face. I had this room installed a couple years ago, but I had never actually used it. The whores I ordered for fast delivery weren't worth bringing down here. All they deserved was a quick fuck or suck in the office, and then it was time for them to get out of my sight. Whips, floggers, and paddles of various sizes hung on the walls. There were two large tables in the middle of the room. One, which had padding on it, was used for strapping someone down. The other one, which was made entirely of wood, held different types of BDSM equipment: handcuffs, ball gags, masks, gloves, lubes, and vibrators. I took her off my shoulder and laid her down on the padded table. She was trembling. Nervous. Afraid. That was understandable. But she definitely wanted it.
18. Caroline. Everything had happened so fast. I could hardly make sense of where I was. The moment his fingers had wrapped around the back of my neck, I knew that things were going to get serious. I was finally going to get the rough treatment that I deserved. Throughout my entire life, people had walked on eggshells around me, afraid to offend me, afraid that I would report them to my father, afraid that if they didn't 100% meet my expectations there would be hell to pay. I was sick of that entitlement and privilege. I was sick of people being so worried about my feelings. I knew they didn't like me. How could they? They must have deeply resented me. But of course, they couldn't act on any of those sentiments. The Chamber's name made sure that. But everything was different with Leonardo. He despised me. And he wasn't afraid to let me know just how he felt. He wasn't worried about my father. And where the hell was my father? If he could see my trembling, naked body strapped to a padded table, would he even care? Was he even thinking about me? Or was he too busy planning how he was going to spend the windfall of cash that he had received for me? I shook those thoughts away. I didn't want to think about it now. I wanted to stay in the moment. All that would have to be dealt with sooner or later. Unlike everybody else who had come and gone in my life, Leonardo wasn't afraid to offend me. Actually, he seemed to rather enjoy it. And I had to admit I liked it when he called me dirty, insulting names. I hoped that he would continue doing so. That kind of disrespect made me wet and tingly. It made my body hot with desire. He had brought me into this room that he called a dungeon. It seemed more like a storage room. There were all kinds of weird contraptions, whips and things hanging from the walls, a large wooden table with strange accessories on it, and a padded table with several straps that I was laying on. There were cuffs around my ankles and wrists. I was spread wide open, naked, vulnerable, and afraid, but also incredibly excited about what would come next. As rough, brutal, and uncaring as Leonardo seemed at times, he also made certain to constantly check in with me about whether or not I fully consented to the dangerous game that we were playing. And my answer was always the same. Yes, 100%. Do whatever you want to me. I'm your property. Use me in whatever way you see fit. And now we're going to begin, he said. Are you ready? I nodded up and down, incapable of forming any words. I asked you if you were ready, you bratty bitch, he said. Open your mouth and answer the fucking question. Before answering, I moaned, as a wave of pleasure swept over me. I just loved when he talked to me like that. Yes, Leonardo. I'm ready. Please don't make me wait any longer. But if you think that I should wait longer, that's okay, but please. Shut up. He yelled. My body quivered. Who do you think I am? Your fucking dad? Do you think that I want to listen to a spoiled, entitled, good-for-nothing slut like you talk? No, I'm sorry. I just. Shut the fuck up, he said, rushing towards me and squeezing my cheeks. His face was only inches from mine. His fingers dug roughly into my flesh. His evil, dark, angry eyes glared at me with an intensity I had never experienced. There was no telling what this man was capable of. He lowered his face closer to mine. I wanted to feel his lips pressed up against mine. I wanted to feel his tongue pushing into my mouth, our tongues swirling around each other. I wanted that passion, that intimacy. But apparently, he had other plans. He took his hands off my face, undid his belt buckle, pulled down his zipper, and reached into his boxers. My eyes and mouth opened wide with shock as he pulled out the biggest, thickest, most menacing dick I'd ever seen in my life. It looked so delicious. But also so dangerous. Like it could break me in two. How would my virgin pussy ever be able to handle something like that? Open your mouth, he commanded. I obeyed. Wider. Once again, I obeyed. Have you ever sucked dick before? He asked, mockingly. I wasn't sure how to answer. I was embarrassed. I'd never given a blowjob before. Just a couple of hand jobs. On more than one occasion, I had masturbated while watching pornos featuring women giving deep throats, being gagged and choked by big dicks. My orgasms had been so intense. But those were just fantasies. I never imagined that I would actually get a chance to do that in real life. And wasn't I supposed to hate that kind of stuff? The degradation, the humiliation of having a big cock rammed down my throat? Wasn't I supposed to find that disgusting? But I didn't feel any of those emotions. I felt really turned on. My pussy ached with desire. I wanted his dick in between my lips. I wanted my tongue swirling around it. I wanted it hitting the back of my throat. I swallowed hard before answering. He was glaring at me. He had me right where he wanted me. And I was right where I wanted to be. No, I said nervously. I've never. You've never sucked a cock before. Is that what you're afraid to say? But you've always wanted to, haven't you? You always wanted a man to treat you like a worthless, cock-hungry whore. Isn't that right? But you just haven't found the right guy yet. Those skinny, art school hipsters just don't get you wet. I wasn't sure whether or not he wanted me to answer, so I kept my mouth shut. Actually, I kept it wide open, hoping that at any moment he would stop talking and shove that delicious piece of dick meat into my mouth. My eyes were riveted on it. Since he had pulled it out of his boxers, it had only gotten larger, thicker, and more menacing. He didn't bother unbuttoning his shirt. Instead, he violently ripped it off, and threw it to the floor, revealing a ripped, tattooed torso. I marveled at his inked flesh. I never suspected that he had any tattoos. None of them were visible in his work clothes. It was as if he was revealing another layer of himself to me. I wanted that to continue. I wanted to know as much about him as possible. Before I had the chance to ask him about any of the tattoos, he grabbed the back of my head and pushed me towards his large, majestic rod, shoving it into my mouth. He moved it in and out, back and forth, his hand forcing my head down on it. He was manhandling me, treating me like a dirty little slut, giving me the rough treatment that I so desperately needed. He stopped thrusting and pulled back. He rubbed the huge, mushroom head of his cock back and forth across my lips. Then he slapped his fat salami against my cheeks. I smiled dreamily as he continued slapping me with his cock, taunting and teasing me with it. I'd never experienced anything like this. Without warning, he stopped pleasing me with his dick. For some reason he began stuffing it back into his boxers, lifting up his zipper, and tying his belt buckle. What was going on? Had I done something wrong? I was so confused. There were so many questions that I wanted to ask him. But I didn't want to anger or annoy him. So I remained quiet. My body quivered with desire. He couldn't leave me like this. I wanted him to make me orgasm. Over and over again. I wanted him to shove that beautiful dick in my pussy and take my virginity. I wanted it to be him. And no one else. Why was he doing this? Why was he going to make me wait? Why was he torturing me like this? Do you want more of that, you horny little bitch? He asked. Yes, please give me more, I pleaded. I need it. I desperately. He cut my words short by wrapping his fingers tightly around my throat. Then you better tell me every fucking thing you know.
19. Leonardo. Somehow I had managed to control the sexual urges that had been bubbling inside of me for the last few days. As I thrust my cock in and out of her sweet, virginal mouth, I'd been sure that I was going to explode, to shoot thick loads of cum all over her beautiful face. But business is business. I had to figure out what she was hiding from me. I took my fingers from around her neck. She winced. I had left a nice mark there. I smiled with satisfaction. I was training her, showing her just how dangerous it would be to fuck with me. She was mine. All mine. If you ever want to see my cock again, then you better start talking. She was still strapped to the padded table. A sheen of sweat covered her flesh. It only made her body look that much more delicious. It was going to take every ounce of my self-control not to get on top of her and fuck her harder than I had ever fucked a woman. My father, she began hesitantly. He was supposed to send someone to get me out of here. I nearly fell over. I couldn't believe what I just heard. And? I asked calmly, masking my shock. Something happened to him. The plan is delayed. So this had been a ruse all along? Fuck. I'd been so fucking stupid. But then my mind went in another direction. How do you know that the plan is delayed? I asked, terrified of what her answer might be. Have you communicated with him since you've been here? Her eyes darted around the room. She didn't answer. Too bad. I reached out for her throat and tightly gripped it. Her eyes looked like they were going to explode from her head. I'm only going to ask you one more time, I said. How do you know? I took my hand off her throat and she coughed. The nurse. The tall, blonde one, she said. I backed away from her, frowning, confused. A tall, blonde nurse? I only had one nurse on the payroll and she was a short, plump brunette. I took out my phone and called Wilson. Yes, sir, he answered. Is everything all right? No, Wilson, everything is not all right. What the hell have you been doing for the last 24 hours? Excuse me, sir, but I'm not sure what the problem is. The problem is that somebody's gotten in here and slipped information to my new piece of property, Miss Chambers. How the hell did that happen, Wilson? You're in charge of security, aren't you? Figure it out. A tall, slim, blonde woman has managed to get inside the mansion. Find her. And also find the other nurse. What the fuck is going on around here? I hung up before he had a chance to respond. I felt like throwing my phone against the wall. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Wilson was the best in the business. But maybe he was losing his edge. Maybe it was time for me to call in my hot-headed little brother, John Luigi, to start assisting him and preparing to eventually take over the role as head security officer. Did the nurse tell you anything else? I asked, turning my attention back to my spread and bound slut. She shook her head vigorously. I believed it. Or maybe I was just fooling myself. No, this time I could tell that she was telling the truth. She didn't tell you anything else about your father? She shook her head again. I turned my back to her and walked around the room. So she doesn't know that her father and mother were kidnapped and killed, I said to myself. And I guess that I'm going to have to tell her.
20. Caroline. Suddenly both his energy and the expression on his face had changed. Should I have lied to him? Denied that I knew anything? I wasn't sure whether or not I had made the right decision. But it was too late now. I hoped that he wasn't angry with me. He grabbed a chair and sat down next to the padded table that I was still strapped to. Was he going to let me free? Or did he have even more titillating torture planned for me? He lowered his head and sighed. I wasn't sure what had come over him. But his mood had clearly changed. I'm really not sure how to tell you this, Caroline, he said, slowly raising his head and staring at me with sad, compassionate eyes. I can still remember the day when I got the news. And I don't think my life has ever been the same. I didn't have a great relationship with my parents, especially my father. He was always so busy with the business. Too focused on making money and expanding his power throughout the city. He really never had time to spend with me. And my mother, well, she just did everything my father wanted, which meant that she didn't pay much attention to me. I never wanted to be a part of the family business, kind of like you, I guess. I wanted my own life. I wanted something that went beyond the name Antonelli, something that was truly my own. But when my father died and my mother killed herself a few weeks later, I felt like I had no choice but to take over. It was my destiny. I couldn't escape it. He stopped talking, sighed heavily, and looked away. He had said so much. He didn't want to take over the family business. That came as a shock to me. He seemed so committed, so passionate about the business and protecting the family name. He seemed so invested in this generation's long feud between our families. Could it really be true that he actually felt the same way I did about not wanting to bear the weight of a family legacy? And why was he telling me this? He stood and walked toward the front of the table where my ankles were bound. He slowly undid the padded cuffs. Then he did the same with the wrist restraints. I was free. But I was afraid to move. I didn't want to get away from him. I wanted him to take me in his arms. I understand if you want to leave, he said. I don't think it's right for me to hold you here any longer. Not after what's happened. What happened? I asked. He looked away, hesitating for a moment. Your parents were kidnapped. And killed. I covered my mouth in shock. Tears streamed down my cheeks. He picked me off the table and cradled me in his powerful arms. I buried my head in his chest and began sobbing uncontrollably.
21. Leonardo. I looked up from my desk and rested my eyes on Caroline's sleeping body. She'd been laying on that couch, covered with a blanket, for the last few hours. Of course, there were many rooms in the mansion where I could have put her. But there was no way I was going to let her out of my sight. She was in such a delicate mental state. And I couldn't help feeling deeply responsible for everything that she was going through. Beyond just feeling guilty or sorry for her, I also empathized with her pain. I had been through it myself. Both of my parents had died so suddenly. And 5 years later, I still hadn't gotten over it. And there was also the question of the Caravaggios, the crime family who were thought to be responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Caroline's parents. They wanted to get their hands on her to finish the job. There was no way that I was going to let that happen. I was still trying to figure out the best way to deal with them while anxiously awaiting for Watson to discover the motive behind their brutality. What were they trying to accomplish, besides sending the message that there wasn't anybody that they were afraid to put their hands on? Those questions would be answered soon enough. Right now, the only thing that I could think about was keeping Caroline safe. There was something so delicate and pure about her. The thought of another man putting his hands on her made me furious. At this point, if I even saw another man looking at her, I would be tempted to choke the life out of him. But these thoughts were crazy. So unlike me. We hardly knew each other. And of course, we were supposed to be sworn enemies. Our hatred for one another was supposed to run so deep. And yet here I was having these possessive, jealous thoughts. If this is what love is, then it was something that was far too dangerous for me to have in my life. I needed my life to be cold, rational, and logical. I needed everything to be perfectly planned out. I couldn't handle the emotions of another human being, their ups and downs. It was too much for me. I sighed and closed my eyes. This wasn't what I needed in my life. But it felt so good. These last few days had made me feel so alive. Knowing that Caroline needed me, that there was no one else for her to turn to, gave me a sense of mission and purpose, which was even more intense than how I'd felt about upholding the family business since my parents died. I had to admit to myself that this also scared the shit out of me. What if something happened to her? What if she was suddenly taken away from me, just like my parents were? There was no way that I'd be able to handle that. If anything happened to her, I was sure that a murderous rage would be unleashed in me. But I wouldn't harm any innocent people. My wrath would only be reserved for other crime families, diabolical bastards who deserve to have their blood spilled in the streets. And that would be just what the Caravaggios deserved. Chambers might have deserved his violent ending. But there was no need to take out Caroline's mother as well, leaving their daughter an orphan in this world. They would have to pay for that. Caroline squirmed on the couch. I got up from my desk and walked over to her. I looked down at her and smiled. Her eyes were still closed, but I could tell she was awake. I knew that she sensed me near her. Moments later, she finally opened her eyes. I got down on one knee to bring myself to her level. I gently stroked her cheek, staring at her with all the kindness and compassion that I could muster. She smiled, took hold of my hand, and kissed it. "Thank you so much for taking care of me," she said. "I must look terrible." "You look beautiful," I said, not really believing that those words had come out of my mouth. I never said stuff like that. "You can sleep for as long as you needed to. There's no rush." There was a tense moment of silence as we stared at each other. It seemed like there was so much that needed to be said but that couldn't be said. We both belonged to the same world, even though I was much deeper in it than she was. Maybe it was best that it stayed that way. Maybe I should leave her alone, not drag her down into the hell in which I had lived for so long. There had to be something better out there for her. Right? I wasn't sure. And I had no idea how to explain all these conflicting thoughts to her. "Did you mean what you said before?" she asked, interrupting my train of thought. "What did I say?" I asked, frowning. "That you wanted to let me go. That you didn't feel right holding me here any longer." I looked away from her, searching my memory. Had I really said that? Yes, I had. Well, maybe not those exact words but something like it. Is that what I'd actually meant? Yes, some part of me did mean that. But now I felt differently. I didn't want to let her go. I didn't even want to let her leave my sight. But I also didn't want her to know how jealous and possessive I suddenly felt. That might push her away. Might scare the shit out of her. And that's the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted her to choose to be here. I wanted her to be desperate to stay by my side. That's the only way that I'd be able to go through with this. I got up from my kneeling position and paced around the room. I knew that her eyes were on me, searching my face for any bit of information that she could pick up. This was such a strange feeling. Having open and honest, emotionally vulnerable conversations with women was not something I did. I never found myself in a position where I would have to lay my feelings on the table for them and accept their decision one way or another. I hated how vulnerable this made me feel. I hated that I couldn't 100% control the outcome of this encounter. And then a strange thought struck me. Out of all the dangerous, criminal activity that I'd been involved with in my life, this moment felt like the most nerve-wracking that I'd ever experienced. I knew that whatever I told her, she would have to make her own decision. And I would have to live with that decision. I finally mustered up the courage to turn and stare directly into her eyes. I'd never been a coward. And I wasn't going to turn into one now. Love was a scary beast. It made my knees buckle, made my heart pound in my chest, and sweat broke out on my forehead. Yet, I wasn't going to run from it. I was going to take it head on, just like I'd done with everything else in my life. Yes, when I said those things I did mean them. I don't think it's right for me to hold you here against your will. You deserve the right to make your own decisions. And whatever you decide, I will try to support you as much as possible. I don't care about how much money I paid for you. I have plenty of money. After I finished speaking, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I expected her to hop off the couch, and come running into my arms, wrapping herself around me, and then I would carry her off to the bedroom, and we would make love. I would take her virginity, bonding her to me forever. But instead of that enthusiastic response, full of love and joy, she frowned, and sat up on the couch, glaring at me. Instinctively, I backed away from her, nearly falling over. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. "Why did you want to buy me in the first place? Just to get back at my father? And now that he's dead you don't care about me anymore?" That was her response? I was actually open and honest with a woman for once in my life, and this is what she throws in my face? I gritted my teeth. I had the urge to rush toward her, grab her shoulders and shake her. Maybe that was a better way to communicate with her. Maybe kind words had no real effect on her. Like I said, you're welcome to leave anytime you want. Answer the fucking question. She screamed, her voice choked with what seemed like both anger and pain. My mouth gaped open. Nobody talked to me like that. There was going to be hell to pay. One way or another, I was definitely going to punish her for that. But for the moment I needed to keep calm. I didn't like where this was going. I had to get control of this situation. I don't appreciate your tone, I replied. But I understand that you're going through a lot at the moment. So I'll try not to hold it against you. So you don't care about me, she said bitterly. And you're willing to just throw me out on the street so that the same people who killed my father can come and get me. Is that right? Caroline, I already told you that. What you're telling me is that you don't give a shit about me. You don't care what happens to me. Just like my father didn't care what happened to me. I bet if those same people give you enough money you'll gladly hand me over to them. Isn't that right? My face turned red with anger. Was she actually accusing me of being the kind of man that her father was? What a disgusting allegation. Rage boiled inside of me. I stomped towards her, staring down, trying my best to intimidate her. I wanted to make that defiant look disappear from her face. I wanted to see her quiver, beg for forgiveness and plead to stay in my mansion, under my protection. But she did none of those things. I could see the pain etched in her face. She wasn't going to back down. That just pissed me off even more. I reached down and grabbed her, lifting her to her feet. And then I put my hand around her throat. Not too hard, but hard enough to send a message. She kept staring at me. What the fuck was wrong with her? I asked myself. Does she want me to hurt her? Is that all you can do? She asked mockingly. Mr. Big Bad. Leonardo Antonelli. Are you scared to hurt me? What the fuck is wrong with you? I said. Don't you see that I'm trying to help you? I don't want your help, you dirty fucking mafia bastard. Then what do you want? I asked, exasperated. She smirked and licked her lips. I want you to fuck me, she said. I want you to pound my virgin pussy. Do you think you're man enough to do that? Or are you too scared that you might hurt me? I took my hand off her throat and turned my back to her. Yes, there was no doubt about it. She was absolutely, certified crazy. Out of her fucking mind. What had I gotten myself into? I should have listened to Wilson. I should have never allowed myself to think that this idea would bring me anything except danger and chaos. But despite all those well-reasoned, rational thoughts that I was now having, I knew that it was too late to turn back. Somehow or another, this spoiled, entitled, bratty bitch had managed to get her claws into me. One moment I felt feelings of love and compassion for her. The next moment I felt hate and rage. I'd never experienced anything like this before. It was incredibly exciting. But also terrifying. And yes, she was right. I was scared of hurting her, of being too rough, of losing control, of going overboard. But I also wanted to hear her scream, to cry out in pain and pleasure, to beg for me to go harder and deeper. I wanted all of that. I could feel my cock throbbing in my pants. I reached down and squeezed it. If you don't come over here right now, then I'm leaving to find a man who has the balls to fuck my tight, virgin pussy. That was all that I could take. This bitch just couldn't shut her goddamn mouth for more than 10 seconds so that I could think. No, she wasn't capable of that. She just had to taunt me. Had to push me and test me to see just how much of her shit I was willing to put up with. Well, this was the end of the line for her. Now she was going to learn a lesson that she would never forget. I rushed towards her, and ripped the robe off her, revealing her pale, virginal flesh. Then I threw her down on the carpet. She shrieked and then smiled. That's more like it, she said. I ripped off my clothes and then hopped on top of her. Once again, I wrapped my fingers around her throat, staring into her eyes with the most intense lust I'd ever felt in my life. My rock-hard, throbbing cock pushed up against her stomach. It felt like it was going to fucking explode. I pressed my mouth against hers and our lips locked. Then our tongues began twisting and twirling. She pulled my head towards her as if she was trying to swallow it. I pulled my mouth away for a moment. We are both panting. Her wide blue eyes searched my face. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing. But you're sure you want to do this? Is this how you want your first time to be? For a moment, we stared at each other in silence. I wanted to give her every possible opportunity to back out. If this wasn't what she really wanted, then there was no way I wanted to go through with it. It was all up to her. Without warning, she cocked her arm back and slapped me across the cheek, making my head spin and my ears ring. Why did you do that? I asked, dazed from the blow. I already told you. If you don't fuck me, then I'm marching right out the front door to find a man who will. It probably won't take me more than. I put my hand over her mouth and squeezed. I'm sick of hearing your fucking voice, I yelled. Spread your legs and shut up. Since she couldn't talk, she smiled with her eyes. Yes, she definitely wanted it. And I was going to give it to her. Every fucking inch. With my free hand, I grabbed my cock and glided it towards her hole. I rubbed the head up and down on the wet lips, lightly brushing the clit. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head. Her body began to quiver. I had her right where I wanted her. I took my hand off her mouth because I wanted to hear her moan. I wanted to hear her cry out, beg and plead. Stick it in, she said desperately. Please, stick it in. Shut up, you spoiled bitch. I yelled. You said that you wanted to be my whore. So that's what you're going to be. I slid down on her body, putting my face right in front of that sweet, pure pussy. I licked up and down on the lips, grazing the bulbous clit head. Her legs were shaking. She seemed like she was already on the verge of a powerful orgasm. I did my best to hold her in place, grabbing her soft ass cheeks with both my hands, keeping that pussy in front of me as if it were the most delicious platter of food that I'd ever encountered. I continued licking up and down, sucking, slurping, feeding on her labia, every few strokes hitting the clit, and making her body jerk and spasm. Yes, right there. She said. Just like that. I was going to tell her to shut up again. But instead, I smirked and went to work on her clit, licking it, flicking it with my tongue, first gently a few times, then vigorously, and then I sucked on it, holding it in my mouth as her body continued to quiver and she continued to beg, plead, and moan for more. Oh, God, she said. I don't know how much more I can take. Please stick it in. I want your cock in me so bad. I can't wait anymore. I'm so fucking wet. Yes, she was definitely dripping wet. My face was covered in her delicious juices. I pushed 2 fingers inside of her, then pulled them out. They were coated with her desire. I shoved them into her mouth. Suck on your own pussy juice and shut the fuck up, I said. She sucked hungrily on the fingers while I continued playing with her clit. I was going to stick my cock inside her soon enough. But at the moment I was thoroughly enjoying keeping my head between her legs. I wanted her to orgasm 3, 4, or 5 times before I would worry about busting my own nut inside of her. Excited about giving her a new sensation, I slipped a finger inside of her in a come hither motion as I continued licking, sucking, slurping, and kissing her sumptuous love mound. Once again, I saw her eyes roll into the back of her head as she shook uncontrollably, a sheen of sweat covering her beautiful, pale flesh.
22. Caroline. I'd never experienced anything like this. My body pressed up against a man's, and it felt like he had complete control of me, with his mouth, his fingers, his eyes, and his spirit. I had lost control of myself. I couldn't stop quivering, moaning, and begging for more and more as an intoxicating sensation washed up and down and back and forth through my veins. He had his head between my legs, his tongue and fingers masterfully playing with my pussy, and when he sucked on the clit, clasping his whole mouth down on it, I felt like I was going to explode. Oh my God, that feels so good, I moaned. Don't stop, please don't stop. And of course, he wouldn't stop. He would continue playing with me as if he had gotten to know my body over years and years and he knew all the right spots to touch. Please stick it in, I said desperately. I want to feel your cock inside of me. It wasn't the first time that I'd begged for him to stick that huge dick deep into my virgin pussy. But like the other times, he ignored me and continued to use his tongue and fingers. Was he taunting me? Teasing me? I wasn't sure. But I knew that I didn't want this night to end until he had taken my virginity. I wanted us to be bonded forever. What was he waiting for? And then without warning, he raised his head from between my legs, smiling lustfully, his face coated with the juices of my desire. I reached down and grabbed him, pulling him towards me. I wanted to taste myself. I wanted to taste him. We shoved our tongues deep into the other's mouth, kissing hungrily, desperately as if this would be both our first and last night together, as if we would wake up tomorrow knowing that this was all wrong, that it couldn't possibly work. We were too different. No, that wasn't it. We were too alike. Both of us were haunted by similar demons. We wouldn't be good for each other. We both needed partners who didn't come from this criminal underworld. We both needed partners who had much healthier relationships with their families. I tried my best to push all those thoughts away and stay in the moment, but those doubts continued assailing me. And then I felt it, what I had been waiting so long for, fearing and desiring. As he pushed inside of me, I could feel myself expanding. My eyes grew wide with fear. It was beginning to hurt, like a pain I'd never felt before, stretching me and filling me. It was so fucking big. I didn't think that I was going to be able to take any more. I wanted to cry out, but he put his hand over my mouth and squeezed. I clawed my fingers into his flesh, wanting to make him feel the pain that I felt. He began moving his hips back and forth slowly, moving his cock in and out of me. I could feel my wetness engulfing his member. And suddenly the pain started to go away, replaced by waves of pleasure that spread throughout my body. He picked up the pace, fucking me harder and deeper as both his hands grasped my ass, pulling me in even closer to him, pushing his cock even deeper into my now deflowered cunt. "Oh my God," I said. "That feels amazing. Please keep fucking me. Please. I want you to come inside of me. Please." A wicked smile lit up his face as he continued thrusting and grunting. His muscles and tattoos looked so hot, covered in a layer of sweat. I never imagined that a man could look so fucking sexy and masculine. With both my hands, I slapped his chest and began yelling at him, "Fuck me harder. You want me to be your whore? Then you better pound my pussy. Take it. It's yours." Without warning, he slapped my face hard, making my ears ring. I was stunned for a moment. I hadn't expected it. Currents of pleasure shot through my body and my pussy got even wetter. "Yes," I said ecstatically. "Just like that. Hit me again. Do it." He smiled, shook his head, and delivered another glorious blow to my face. I was going to yell at him again, but his powerful hand clasped over my mouth. He grunted and groaned, pushing his glorious cock deeper and deeper. "I'm gonna come," he said. "Is that what you want? Is it?" "Yes. Yes." And before I could say any more, I lost control of myself and began shaking. For so long, this is what I'd been waiting for, a powerful orgasm that completely took hold of me, a dominant alpha male who knew all the right buttons to push and wasn't afraid of going too far or being too rough. It was like a dream. It couldn't be real. But it was. I could feel his muscles and his sweat. Could feel that big dick inside of me, letting loose a torrent of sperm, filling me up as he moaned and thrust his hips into me. It was like a hose being shot inside of me. His juices and mine spilled out of my no longer virgin pussy onto the carpet. I wrapped my legs around him. Exhausted and covered in sweat, he huffed and puffed. He'd given me all of his energy and passion. I felt so proud. I felt so close to him at that moment. This sort of passion, intensity, and lust were things that I would have never imagined possible. Or maybe I could imagine it happening to another young woman, one with a much more interesting and unpredictable life. But not me. I'd always been so sheltered. But ever since Leonardo had come into my life, everything had been turned upside down. Yet, this couldn't continue, right? This was only a brief moment in time that I was experiencing, and things would soon go back to normal, right? He must have had so many other women in his life that would love to be in this position. I couldn't imagine why he would choose me. There was no sense in lying to myself. He could replace me at any time. As much as this moment meant to me, it probably wasn't a big deal for him. I'm sure that I wasn't the first virgin he deflowered. He slowly lifted his heavy body off of me and pulled his cock out of my pussy. Suddenly I felt empty. He had completely filled me up, and not just physically, but on a deeper level as well. Now he was going to leave. Would he ever want to do this again with me? Was I even any good? "Is everything all right?" I asked nervously. He smirked. "That was fucking incredible. Your pussy felt go good." I blushed. And I could feel my face turning red. I had never received a compliment like that before. But I couldn't help feeling a little insecure. Maybe he was just saying that. Maybe he said that to all the women he dealt with. "Do you really mean that?" I said, staring him deeply in the eyes, trying to detect even the slightest bit of deceit. "When I give a compliment, I always mean it. Understand?" I nodded up and down, tears welling up in my eyes. This wasn't the moment to cry. I needed to get control of myself. Hoping he wouldn't notice all the emotions that were about to spill out of me, I quickly wiped away the first drops. "What's going on?" he asked apprehensively. "I hope I didn't hurt you. And I hope you don't regret what we did." His words made me feel so guilty. There was no way that I wanted him to think any of those thoughts. "No, no," I said, shaking my head vigorously, more tears rushing down my cheeks. "That was incredible. Better than I could have ever imagined. It's just that." "Is it because of our family names?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. I didn't like the way that he was looking at me. Why would he ask me that? I didn't care about any of that stuff. At least, I didn't think that I did. No, it's not that at all, I replied. Then what is it? He shot back. It's just that I'm not used to these types of feelings and they scare me. Us being together like this scares me. It feels too good to be true. And like it's not something I deserve. What the hell do you mean you don't deserve it? That sounds crazy. Everyone deserves to feel like this. But don't you do this a lot? With all the women you're with? He snickered and shook his head. I hope you're not worried about what I do with other women. Because trust me, it's nothing compared to what we just did. Really? I asked, desperately wanting to believe him. I don't know if I've ever felt that sort of lust and passion, but also tenderness and sweetness before. It was fucking incredible. That was all I needed to hear. I reached out and grabbed him, pulling him towards me, kissing him hungrily on the lips several times, and then wrapping my arms around him and burying my head in his chest. As we lay in that tight embrace, there were 3 words that I wanted to say. But they were stuck in my throat or maybe somewhere further down in my chest. I wanted to say those words while looking deeply into his eyes. And there were 4 words that I wanted to hear him say. But I didn't have the courage at that moment. If he didn't respond the way I wanted him to, if he didn't reciprocate my feelings, I might completely break down. I wouldn't be able to handle it. So I didn't say anything. I kept my mouth shut and my head on his chest. Several hours later, or maybe it was the next day, I woke up groggy and sore. There was a strange sensation between my legs that I'd never felt before. I was worried for a moment. But then I remembered last night's activities. I smiled and wiped the sleep from my eyes. I felt like a new woman. The last thing I remembered was going to sleep on the carpet in this office with my head resting on Leonardo's chest. But now I was laying on the couch with a blanket over me. He must have moved me while I was sleeping. Thinking about my limp body in his powerful arms filled me with satisfaction and also desire. I wanted him to take me again, on the couch or on the carpet. I didn't care. I needed his beautiful body on top of me, pumping and pounding away. Have I been sleeping for a long time? I asked, assuming that Leonardo was sitting at his desk working while also keeping a watchful eye over me. When I didn't receive a response, I sat up on the couch and looked towards his desk. He wasn't there. For a moment, I was shocked. He said that he was never going to leave my side. That he would always have an eye on me. But a few hours after taking my virginity, he had already left me in here alone. There was no telling who was after me. Any of my father's enemies, people that he had either harmed or screwed over, wouldn't hesitate to put their hands on me if they had the chance. With Leonardo by my side, I felt safe and protected. Like no one would ever try to do anything to me as long as he was there. But when he wasn't around, I felt vulnerable and alone, a lost orphan in a dangerous and cruel world. How could he do this to me? I'd given him something so precious, and this was how he showed his gratitude? And I actually believed all that crap he said about our sexual experience being different than anything he'd ever had before. Lies. It was all lies. And I was just a stupid, naive girl who believed it. It made me sick. I didn't know who I was angrier with. Him or myself. Either way, I was not going to tolerate this kind of treatment. I walked to the door and tried to pull it open. But it was stuck. I turned the knob and pulled harder. It didn't budge. I pounded on it with my fist and began yelling, "Help! Let me out of here! The door's locked! Help me!" After a few minutes of hysterical banging and screaming, I gave up, sinking to the floor with my head in my hands. This was the same way that my father had treated me when he'd been worried about my safety. He didn't trust me to be able to handle myself in the world alone. Didn't trust that I could use common sense and stay out of trouble. No, he had to take any decision-making power out of my hands and lock me in a room. And that's exactly what Leonardo was doing. I'd gone from one controlling, domineering man to another. Was this my fate? Was my life always going to be like this? And what if something happened to Leonardo? What man's hands would I fall into next? And would he end up being even worse? I shook my head from side to side, trying my best to rid my mind of these intrusive, haunting thoughts. I just needed to stay calm. I didn't know how I was going to do that. But thinking about all the terrible things that could possibly happen certainly wasn't going to help. I got up from the floor, wiped my eyes, and tied up my hair in a messy bun. I looked at the large screen TV on the wall and smiled. Yes, that was just what I needed. Some dumb television shows to distract me. I grabbed the remote and turned it on. I flipped through several channels aimlessly. I landed on a news station and was about to change the channel when I saw a black Audi that looked very familiar. It had been riddled with bullet holes. I put my hand over my mouth. Whoever had been in the car must have been in bad shape, if not dead. I shivered. A horrible feeling shot through me. I felt sick. I should have turned the television off. I should have laid down on the couch and gone back to sleep. I must have been hallucinating. Having a bad dream. Yes, it must have been something like that. But for some reason, I raised the volume and fixed my eyes on the screen. Hi, this is James Holloway for WXTR News, and I'm on the scene of yet another crazy shooting here in Manhattan. This brazen attack occurred just after 2 p.m. in Midtown, right in front of Vittorino's Steakhouse. Police sources have not disclosed whether or not there have been any victims. But from looks of that black Audi over there, it's hard to imagine that no one was hurt. I dropped to the floor. There was no way this could be happening. The NYPD has confirmed that Vittorino's is a known hangout spot for organized crime members. At this time they are not confirming whether or not this shooting is related to mafia activity, but I expect to receive that confirmation shortly. I had to be dreaming, or maybe this was a nightmare. I had to get out of this criminal world. It wasn't for me. I needed to go abroad. Europe, Asia, South America. Somewhere I could start over. Where no one would know my name. I'd just be another dumb, annoying American expat. That sounded perfect. My sources are telling me that the bullet-riddled black Audi belongs to the head of the notorious Antonelli crime family, Leonardo Antonelli. I got a glimpse of the inside of the vehicle and there was blood everywhere. So whoever was inside the car at the time of the attack probably didn't make it out alive.
23. Leonardo. After finally taking Caroline's virginity and spending one of the most memorable nights of my life with her, I knew that I was going to do everything in my power to protect her. That meant that I was going to have to find a way to deal with the Caravaggios. They wanted to get their hands on her. And I knew that they were willing to kill anybody who stood in their way. But I also knew that they weren't crazy, at least not completely. I had a feeling that I could bribe them with money or property. And if I made the offer sweet enough, I might be able to make them forget about Caroline. Was I being naive? Was I forgetting just how cruel people in this underground world could be? That was possible. But maybe something else was going on with me. Maybe love had sunk its hooks into me, or Cupid had struck me with one of his potent arrows. These strange and unfamiliar feelings were screwing up my entire thought process. It was a harsh reality that I had to face. Love and the life I had chosen to live just were not compatible. The best thing to do, the most mature and reasonable thing to do, would be to put Caroline on a plane to a foreign country and allow her to start over, thousands of miles away from all this mafia madness. She wanted nothing to do with this world. She'd been born into it just like I had. But unlike me, she still had time to go in another direction. Every day that she spent by my side would just pull her in deeper and deeper. I couldn't do that to her. I had to set her free, no matter how much it hurt me to think about her in the arms of another man, looking into his eyes with love and admiration, having his child. Thinking about it made me furious. But I didn't see any other way. I pulled my bulletproof SUV into the abandoned warehouse in the meatpacking district of Manhattan. For the last couple of hours, I'd been watching the news reports. Everything had gone according to plan. Now I just had to be patient. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Maybe I was in this much deeper than I should have been. But I didn't see any way to get out of it now. And I really had no desire to do so. I heard a car coming down the alley towards the entrance to the warehouse. I put my hand on my holster and took several deep breaths. But I immediately relaxed when I saw my little brother's red Porsche approaching me. I hadn't seen Gianluigi in a few days, but it felt like so much longer than that. So much had happened in the last 72 hours. And things weren't about to slow down anytime soon. "Hey, big bro," he said, smiling and opening his arms wide. "I can't believe you made it out of there alive. You must be bulletproof or something." I smirked and shook my head. "Installing the remote-controlled steering system a year ago was Wilson's idea," I replied. "I get that part. But where did all the blood come from?" Every news report said the inside of the car was covered in blood. Must have looked like a fucking massacre. I couldn't help laughing. "I might have overdone it with that," I said. I got a few bags of cow blood from my butcher on 37th Street and I hung them from the ceiling. Damn. I didn't know that you could come up with something so clever. I frowned and narrowed my eyes. I didn't like how nonchalant he was being. This was a serious situation. I knew that the Caravaggios were looking for me. I didn't know how serious they were about getting me out of the way so that they could put their hands on Caroline. So I decided to test the waters. That's why I told them that I would meet them outside of Vitorino's. I had intentionally made myself a sitting duck, just to see if they would start firing. So what would you have done in my place, Mr. Mastermind Supervillain? I couldn't help asking. First of all, I don't really understand why the Caravaggios want to kill you, he said. Maybe you could explain that to me. I spent the next 5 minutes telling him how I'd gotten myself into the middle of this situation. Shock covered his face as I explained the deal that I had signed with Chambers just before his untimely demise. That's fucking crazy, he said, pulling out another cigarette and lighting it. 200 million? There's no way she's worth that. You must have lost your mind. I clenched my jaw. Veins bulged in my neck and forehead. I took a few steps toward him. Since our parents died, it had been my responsibility to care for him. And that was something that I had always taken a lot of pride in. But if he ever said a disrespectful word about Caroline, I wouldn't hesitate to hurt him. I took another menacing step toward him and put my hand on my holster. He backed up. What the hell is wrong with you? He asked, fear creeping into his voice and eyes. Between clenched teeth, I said, she's worth every goddamn penny and a lot more. Do you understand? Yeah, sure, man, there's no need to. I grabbed his shirt and pulled him towards me, bringing us nose to nose. Do you understand? I repeated. He turned his head away. He probably wanted to fight me. He would have definitely fought anybody else who dared put their hands on him. But he knew better than to do that with me. I'm sorry, bro. I didn't mean to say anything disrespectful. But you should have told me earlier what was going on. I took my hands off him, turned my back, and walked around in silence for a few moments. I had to get a hold of my emotions. I didn't like the path I was going down. If I wasn't careful, I would end up doing something reckless or crazy. When I had finally composed myself, I turned around and faced him. I'm sorry for losing my cool, I said. But I feel very protective of Caroline. She doesn't have anyone in the world, except me. And I'm going to do everything in my power to keep her safe. Shit, are you serious? Very fucking serious, I replied. I never heard you talk this way about a girl before. You usually just hire all those. I put my hand in the air, signaling for him to stop talking. I didn't want to be reminded of my past sexual escapades. This is something completely different, I said. I didn't think it was going to be like this when I bought her. I didn't think that I was going to end up caring about her. And deeply. Deeply? Are you telling me that you love her or something? A fucking Chambers? A current of rage shot through me. But I wasn't sure who or what I was angriest with. Myself? John Luigi? This stupid family rivalry and hatred? I wasn't sure. I sighed and shook my head. There was no point in being mad at my brother. He loved me and would be willing to do whatever I asked him to do. Of course, he would do it in his own unique way, which almost always meant creating a great deal of chaos. But he would still get the job done. No matter what it was. Honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, I finally said. Maybe I'm being stupid. Maybe I'm getting soft. I don't know. But it feels right. There's nothing wrong with a good love story, he said. We can't be lonely, tough guys forever, right? I cocked my head to the side and smiled at him. That's not what I'd expected him to say. I couldn't believe that my big, bad little brother who loved smashing in people's heads and making them piss in their pants, actually had a sentimental, romantic side to him. He must have been able to read my thoughts. Don't get me wrong, he said defensively. Business is business. And that's what always comes first. But every guy in this life needs at least one solid woman. You think so? I asked, not quite sure whether or not he was bullshitting me. Fuck yeah. I know I act crazy and all that. And maybe I am crazy. But I still want to settle down one day. Soon? I asked skeptically. He hesitated, taking a deep drag on his cigarette, and blowing out a large cloud of smoke. Nah, probably not. But someday. We stared at each other for a moment in silence and then we burst out laughing. I love you little, bro, I said. Love you too, you old bastard. If you need me to do anything, don't hesitate to ask. That's just what I wanted to hear. I spent the next hour driving around the city, mostly lost in my own thoughts, but also keeping an eye on my mirrors, making sure that nobody was following me. That wasn't likely, though. I'd never brought this car out on the street before, so none of my enemies would be looking for it. I couldn't help thinking back on the conversation that I had with my brother. He was the only person that I had talked to about Caroline, the only person that I had revealed my true feelings to. That wasn't something I normally did. I never talked about my feelings. Most of the time, I tried to not even think about my feelings. But this was the effect that she was having on me. She was forcing me to grow and mature. It was so strange. Exciting but also terrifying. Did I want this relationship with her to continue? Did I want us to spend more time with each other and get to know each other on deeper and deeper levels? Absolutely. But still, there were the doubts that gnawed deep within me. And it went beyond the Antonelli and Chambers thing. More than anything else, it was my fear that I could lose her. That she could be taken from me. That I wouldn't be able to protect her. Like I wasn't able to protect my father or my mother. And that's why I felt like I had to get her out of New York City as soon as possible. And not just out of New York City, but out of the country as well. She needed to be tens of thousands of miles away. And she would have to stay there, at least until everything with the Caravaggios boiled over. What did that mean? I wasn't sure. But the heads of their crime family would have to be cut off. It was going to be very messy and bloody. I was counting on John Luigi and his goons to take care of the job for me. This would be the biggest mission that I'd ever entrusted him with. It would be a chance for him to really make a name for himself in this mafia underworld. And while all that blood was running through the streets, ambulance sirens were blaring, and news crews were racing to the scene of yet another shooting, Caroline would be far away, living in Argentina, France, or Vietnam. Wilson was making the preparations right now. She would have apartments in Buenos Aires, Lyon, and Saigon, as well as a 24/7 security detail. Of course, she could work if she wanted to. But there would always be money in her bank accounts. Why 3 different countries? Just so if she ever needed to move quickly, she would have a place to go. That seemed like the safest option. I hadn't run any of this by her yet. But I wasn't going to give her a choice. She didn't understand how serious the situation was. I did. She also had no one else to protect her, so she would have to listen to me. I didn't care if she was angry with me or if she kicked, screamed, and protested. I was willing to be patient with her. But I wasn't willing to lose her. I wasn't willing to go to sleep at night, terrified of whether or not she would still be alive in the morning. But maybe sending her away would cause me to lose her anyway. Was it really the only solution? I closed my eyes and squeezed my temples. I was so sick of this life, so sick of the plotting and scheming, constantly looking over my shoulder, worrying about when rather than if my day would come, when that bullet with my name on it would finally pierce my flesh. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine. I knew that Caroline was still upstairs in my office. I had several cameras in there, which allowed me to watch her as she screamed and pounded the door with her fists, crying for help. Yep, I'd seen all that. She probably thought that I had left her in there all alone and unprotected. But that was far from the case. 2 armed guards were standing outside the whole time. Nobody was getting in there. And she wasn't getting out of there. And maybe that was the solution. Maybe I could just keep her locked up in the mansion. When I walked into my office, I saw Caroline lying on the floor, curled up in a ball. She looked so innocent, pure, and vulnerable in that position. My first instinct was to rush toward her, pick her up, wrap my arms around her, and take her to my bedroom. I tiptoed towards her, got down on one knee, and gently shook her. She didn't wake up right away. I shook her again, this time a bit more forcefully. Caroline, I'm back. Wake up. With her eyes still closed, she said, No, I don't want to see the body. He's dead. Everyone I love is dead. My father. My mother. And now Leonardo. They're all gone. I'm cursed. Everyone who comes into my life ends up getting murdered. I stood up and backed away from her. I couldn't believe what I just heard. Did that mean that she loved me? Is that what she had said? I never had a woman say those words to me. Even if technically, she hadn't said those words to me yet, it was still close enough. I never thought that a woman would ever be able to see beyond all the power and status that I could confer on her. That a woman would ever truly be able to look past all that and see the hurt and scarred human being underneath. The boy who had been forced to become a man, a cold, ruthless, murderous man, far too soon. I was only 25. I should have been out doing all the other stupid things that 25-year-olds did, figuring out my way in the world, getting my feet wet in a career, meeting girls on dating apps, fucking them, and never talking to them again. Or whatever you were supposed to do at this age. But instead, I was running a crime family, sending my little brother out to assassinate rival mafia members. Instead of paying for $200 dates, I had spent $200 million to take ownership of the scared and traumatized young woman who was laying on my carpet, rocking back and forth, talking in her sleep, as she tried to shake free from the clutches of a nightmare. What a completely fucked up life I was living. Suddenly, she stopped rocking from side to side and talking. Her eyes opened wide and she stared at me. She looked like she'd just seen a ghost. She hopped off the floor and started screaming. "Help me! Help me! Who are you? Leonardo's dead. Who are you? Where am I? Let me go." I slowly walked toward her, fearful that she might lash out at me. She was clearly hallucinating, losing her mind, moving closer and closer to the edge of a nervous breakdown. And I couldn't blame her. She'd been through a hell of a lot. All I wanted to do was comfort her, be that chest that she could rest on, be those protective arms that would never let anything happen to her. I just needed her to give me that chance. That's all I wanted. "Caroline, it's me, Leonardo. Alive and in the flesh." She covered her mouth and continued backing away from me, her eyes bugging out of her head. "No, no, no, you can't be Leonardo," she said. "He's dead. I saw it on the news. His car was shot up and there was blood everywhere." "Shit," I said under my breath, looking at the large screen TV on the wall. I should have gotten rid of that thing before I left her alone in here. I hadn't thought that she would turn it on and see all those false news stories. I felt terrible about that. But in a sick and twisted way, I also felt good that she was so shaken up about the news. I guess that meant that she did really care about me. "That was just part of my plan," I explained. "I wanted to see how far the Caravaggios would go to get me out of the way." "Out of the way?" she said, pulling her hand away from her mouth. "You mean like, dead?" "Yes, that's exactly what I mean." "Aren't those the same people that killed my parents?" I nodded up and down. "And now they want to kill us?" Once again, I nodded. "Please don't ever leave me alone again. I'll do anything you want. Just don't leave my side." Before I could respond, she rushed toward me and buried her head in my chest. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her tightly to me. "No one's ever going to hurt you," I said. "Unless they kill me first."
24. Caroline. Before Leonardo woke me up, I'd been having the worst nightmare I'd ever experienced. I saw the bloody, lifeless bodies of both my parents. And then I saw Leonardo being dragged out of his bullet-riddled car with blood spilling out of him. And there was nothing I could do. He was gone. Then I turned around and saw a group of men charging towards me, knives in their hands, their eyes lit up sadistically. They were going to carve me up and feast on my flesh. I screamed and screamed for help, but no one came to rescue me. I was all alone. When he did manage to wake me up, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no way that he could possibly be alive, not after what had happened to his car. I had already begun trying to reconcile myself with the fact that he was gone. That I would never taste his lips again, would never feel his powerful arms wrapping around me, his muscular hips thrusting on top of me, his beautiful dick moving in and out of me, filling me up, making me overflow with pleasure. I had already begun accepting that all of that was gone. We had shared one incredible night together and then it was over. It was so cruel. So bittersweet. I figured that I would eventually get over it. No matter how much it hurt me. No matter how much of a hole it permanently left in my heart. But just as I was willing to accept his death, he had returned alive and triumphant, telling me that the shooting had all been part of some big plan that he had concocted. I wasn't sure what to think. I wanted this man in my life. I wanted him by my side. I loved him. I was sure of that. And I wanted him to love me. But I didn't think I could handle being a part of this world. It wasn't for me. I couldn't live every day not knowing whether or not he would come home, not knowing whether or not I would ever see him again. And yet, I had no idea how I was going to tell him that I had to leave. I wasn't meant to be a mafia wife. I wasn't going to be like my mother, dutifully obeying all my husband's commands. And then ending up dying violently right by his side. I just wasn't cut out for that. We were standing in the middle of Leonardo's office. He had his powerful arms wrapped around me. I felt so safe and protected in his embrace. But I knew this couldn't last forever. And there was no sense dragging things out. It wouldn't work. Couldn't possibly. We needed to stop lying to ourselves. I think I need to sit down, I said, slowly trying to break free of his hold on me. He walked me over to the couch and helped me gently lower myself onto it. I brushed the hair out of my face and looked up at him. Then I lowered my head and tried to gather my thoughts. "Is everything okay?" he asked, sitting down next to me and clasping my hand. There was no sense in lying. I wasn't any good at that anyway. This was the moment to tell the truth, to let him know what I really thought of us and our relationship. I sighed and finally turned to him. "I've never felt this way about a man. And I'll remember the time that we've spent together for the rest of my life. I'm sure of that. I feel like a completely different woman than I was that day I first saw you in my father's office." "It's been a wild ride so far," he said. "I hope it doesn't end any time soon." I started to smile, but then I shook my head from side to side. No, I said. "It can't continue. We have to end it now. I have to leave." "I agree," he said. "You have to leave. And I've already made the appropriate accommodations for you." My mouth gaped open. I had no idea how to respond. He wasn't upset. He didn't care that I wanted to break things off. He didn't even want to know why I felt like I had to leave. "Wilson has been putting everything in place for you," he said. "You'll have apartments in Buenos Aires, Lyon, and Saigon. Your bank accounts will always be full. But of course, if you want to, you can work. You will have a 24/7 security detail and you will need to be ready to hop on a plane at a moment's notice." When he finished speaking, he had the biggest, most irritating grin on his face. He seemed really proud of himself for being able to dictate the terms of my life to me. And that's how it would always be with men like him. They would never allow me to truly be free. They would always have to guard me under lock and key. They would never realize that instead of protecting me, they were actually suffocating me. I stood up and walked away from him. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the confusion on his face. He must have expected me to fall into his arms, thanking him for making all of my decisions for me. "No, I don't think you understand what I'm saying," I said. "I'm done with this life. No more running. No more looking over my shoulder. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going abroad to start over and I'm going to do it by myself. I don't want your money. And I don't want your security detail." He stood up and came towards me, his glaring eyes burning a hole through me. Finally, he was going to show some real emotion. "And you think it's going to be that easy?" he asked, snickering. "It might not be easy," I replied. "But at least it'll be a life. At least I won't have to be locked up in a room all day. At least I won't have to take orders from a man who thinks he knows what's best for me when he hardly knows what's best for himself." He grabbed me by the shoulders, there was rage in his face. "Go ahead," I said. "Hit me. Do it. You know you want to. Tell me that I'm an ungrateful, spoiled bitch." His lips quivered. I felt certain that he was about to lose control of himself. But suddenly he let go of my shoulders, mumbled something under his breath, and sat back down on the couch. "So none of this meant anything to you?" he said. "It was all just an act like that day in your father's office." "What are you talking about?" I asked, disgustedly. "The days I've spent with you have been the greatest time of my life. But I can't do this. I can't live like this. I don't want to be locked up. And I don't want to have to worry every day about you getting killed. I know what this life is and it's not for me. I don't want the Chambers name anymore, but I don't want the Antonelli name either. I know this is your world. But it's not mine. It's not that easy, Caroline. You're a part of this world whether you want to be or not." I couldn't bear to look at him. I knew that he was right. But I was too stubborn to admit it. "I know that I might be making the wrong decision," I said. "And I'm afraid of what could happen if I'm out on my own. But I'm even more afraid of what'll happen if I never leave." "You'll be safe and protected," he replied. "I'll never leave your side except when I have important business to care of." "And that's exactly the problem," I shot back. "I don't want you by my side all the time. I don't want to feel like every single move I make is being watched over. I'm not a fucking child. That's not a problem, he said. I'll always have important business to take care of, so there will be plenty of time when I won't be watching over you. Bullshit, I said. Even if you're not around, you'll have cameras or armed guards observing my every move. He sighed and threw his head back. If that's how you really feel, then I'm not going to stop you. But I want you to know that I understand. What do you mean? About wanting to build a life of your own. And not wanting to carry the weight of the family name anymore. I sat down on the couch, hope surging through my body. I took hold of his hands and stared deeply into his eyes. Then why don't we run away together? We can leave all this behind. We can start over. Enthusiasm took hold of me. It never occurred to me that we could run away together. He seemed so wedded to this life. But maybe there was a chance. As much as it hurts me to admit, I don't think I can do that, he said. I want to leave this life behind, but I'm afraid of starting over. This is all I've ever known. My heart sank. This was it. It was over.
25. Leonardo. I can't believe I let her walk out that door. What the hell was I thinking? Why did I allow her to make her own choice? She belonged to me. She was my property. I could do with her as I saw fit. But for some reason, I'd allowed my heart to turn soft. Just at a point in time when I needed to be cold and ruthless, when I needed to give orders and not accept anything less than 100% obedience. I hadn't been able to do it. It made me sick thinking about it. Instead of grabbing her by the back of the neck and dragging her down to the dungeon, strapping her to the table, and making her submit, cry, beg, scream, and plead for mercy, I'd allowed her to talk me into letting her leave. She wasn't just leaving my mansion. She was also leaving the city and the country. She would be going somewhere abroad to start over. She didn't want my help. Not my money, connections, or protection. She wanted none of it. And of course, her parents were gone, so the Chamber's name wouldn't be able to protect her either. She would be all alone and an easy target for her father's enemies, bloodthirsty villains, who weren't satisfied with the death of him and his wife. They wanted his only offspring to be dead and buried as well. They were sick, sadistic bastards. But they were also very clever and had the latest surveillance technology at their disposal. If there was no one to protect Caroline, it wouldn't be long before they sank their fangs into her. But she knew that. She was aware of how dangerous it would be for her out there. Yet she still chose to face that danger alone, rather than have me protect her. Had I really been that overprotective? Had my desire to keep her locked up and away from danger really bothered her that much? If the answers to those questions were yes, then I had no one to blame but myself. But I still shouldn't have let her walk out. Could I have done something different to make her change her mind? And then I remembered what she had said just before she left my office. She'd come up with the idea of us both leaving this crazy mafia world. We would go somewhere abroad, start over, and build lives that we actually wanted to live. We would no longer live the lives that were handed to us by our parents. And of course, we would live happily ever after, get married, have some babies, and grow old together. It was possible. We might really be able to pull it off. Her eyes were full of hope and enthusiasm. She really meant it. But at that moment, I didn't have the courage to agree with her. I didn't have the courage to take that leap and leave behind everything so familiar to me. I slammed my fist into my desk and stood up. I paced around my office, grinding my teeth and cursing. How had I been so fucking stupid? For so long, I'd thought of myself as some type of macho, alpha guy with the ladies. I could say and do anything to them. No matter how harsh or insulting I was, they were always desperate to see me again. I actually had begun to think that I had some special, secret sauce. But that clearly wasn't the case. I was just used to dealing with whores. I had never dealt with a woman that I actually cared about. A woman that I wanted a future and a family with. A woman that I wanted to give my last name. I didn't even have the decency to walk her down to the driveway and wait with her until the taxi arrived. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too stunned. I never expected things to end this way. Honestly, I never expected things to end at all. I'd stood at the window, looking down at her as she waited for the car that would take her away from me forever. I had even expected her to turn around, come running back inside, sprinting up the steps, and then into my office, jumping into my arms, her face bathed in tears. She was going to tell me how much she loved me. How she couldn't live without me. She was going to tell me that she would do anything that I wanted her to do, even if that meant being locked up and under constant surveillance. She was willing to do it. That's how strong her love for me was. But of course, None of that had happened. The car had pulled up. The driver had gotten out and opened the door. She had gotten into the backseat and closed the door. Then moments later the car vanished. And that was it. No Hollywood ending. No happily ever after. Just the bitter taste of reality. We weren't the magical couple who were able to overcome their differences, in particular the hatred that had existed between our families for 100 years. We hadn't been able to do that. And now what were we? If I was being honest with myself, I would have to admit that I wasn't sure what she was. A strong, independent, free-spirited woman who was going to take life by the horns? Possibly. Or maybe she was just an immature, spoiled brat who was determined to have her way no matter what, whether it was in her best interest or not. Only time would tell. But I knew what I was. There was no doubt about it. A coward. A scared little boy play-acting the role of a man. The more I thought about how I let Caroline slip through my fingers, the angrier I became. I was going to have to hurt somebody. Somebody was going to have to suffer. I had to purge this rage boiling inside me. Violence was the only way. I plopped down into my chair, my head hanging weakly between my shoulders. Just thinking about going on a violent rampage was exhausting. The more blood I shed, the deeper and deeper I would be pulled into this world. That's not what I wanted. I wanted Caroline. I wanted us to be together. It was possible. I truly believed that it was. Even if it was a long shot, I was still willing to give it a try. I had to. If I didn't, I would live the rest of my life full of regret and bitterness, wondering about what could have been, if only I'd been willing to take the risk. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of the only person that could help me. He picked up. "What's going on, big bro?" Gianluigi said. I smiled and wiped a tear from my eye. It was so good to hear his voice. "I've got a job for you and your goons," I said. There was a brief moment of silence. I could hear my heart beating. There would be no turning back from this decision. It might create an all-out war. Or it might lead to a tense, but stable peace. There was no way to know for sure. But I was willing to take that chance. For Caroline. For us. "What kind of job?" he asked. "A very messy and bloody one." "Can't wait."
26. Caroline. I couldn't stop crying in the back of the cab. Several times the driver had turned around and asked me in a heavy Middle Eastern accent if everything was okay. I would wipe away the tears as best I could, and tell him that yes, I was fine. Please just get me to my destination on the Lower East Side. My friend is waiting for me. At least that last part was true. Samantha was waiting for me. We were going to meet at the Hidden Bush Bar, the same place we'd met a week ago when everything in my life was so much different. Last week my parents were still alive. My father had been badly beaten and bruised, but he was poised to make a comeback. He was going to pull himself out of debt, land a big real estate deal, and continue expanding his empire. And my mother was going to be right by his side. I even thought that I would be able to help them. For once in my life, I would do something instead of just taking and asking for more. I wanted to become an asset to my family instead of a liability. Last week I had never heard of Leonardo Antonelli. I had no idea who he was and never thought that I would care. I would never have imagined that a man so cruel, so cold, so bloodthirsty, would be able to make my heart melt. Would be able to make me feel things that I'd never felt before. In the short time that we'd known each other, I'd seen so much more of him than the rough exterior. I'd seen his wounds and his pain. I'd seen his kind, caring, compassionate side. And I'd also seen his hot, sexy, erotic side. He had taken my virginity. I had gladly given it to him. There's nothing I would have changed about that experience. It went well beyond my wildest dreams about what I thought my first time would be. I only wished that it could have gone on forever, that the sun would have never come up the next day, that I wouldn't have woken up on the couch, and looked over it at his empty chair. Why couldn't we have just frozen that moment in time? We could have stayed there, on the floor of his office, forever and ever. I sighed and wiped away another river of tears. The cab finally arrived at the bar. Before opening the door I looked out the window. Samantha was standing outside alone, smoking a cigarette, looking up and down the block. I thanked the cab driver and got out. Samantha rushed towards me with her arms wide. We hugged tightly, then walked into the bar. "I'm so sorry, Caroline," she said. "I heard the news report about your parents and I've been calling you and texting you. I thought something had happened to you too. No, I'm fine, I said. At least I think so. I'm so sorry for not returning your calls. My head just wasn't in the right place. I'm really sorry. Don't worry about it, she said, reaching out and holding my hand. It's all right. But where have you been staying? I went by your house and there were a bunch of police cars outside. They said it was an active crime scene and no one was allowed in. I asked them if they knew where you were and they said they had no idea. I bit down on my bottom lip and hesitated before answering. I didn't know how much of the story I should tell Samantha. As long as I was in Manhattan, my life was in grave danger. But don't worry about that, she continued. After we have some drinks here, we're going to a rooftop party a few blocks away. There're going to be lots of hot guys. Her face beamed with excitement and her eyes glistened with lust. I looked away. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to hug her or strangle her. I knew that she was trying to make me feel better. But the last thing I felt like doing was going to a party. It was at that moment that I knew I had to leave. I had to go back to Leonardo. I needed him. There was no way I was going to be able to live without him. Even if it meant being under constant security. He was only doing it to protect me. It wasn't to control me or to demean me. He wanted to do everything to keep me safe. It was his way of showing love. Why hadn't I recognized that before? I'd been so stupid. I just wanted to fall into his arms, rest my head on his chest, cry, and apologize for walking out on him. I'm sorry, Sam, but I have to go. I made a mistake. A big mistake. Please forgive me. I'll call you in a couple days. Okay. Samantha had a stunned look on her face. If you don't want to go to the party, I understand. We could just go back to my place and talk and drink. I totally get it. I shook my head vigorously from side to side. There's something really important that I have to do. I'm so sorry. I kissed her on the cheek and hugged her tightly. Then I picked up my purse and headed out of the bar. I walked a few blocks west and crossed the street. I didn't want Samantha coming out of the bar looking for me. I didn't want to take the risk that she would convince me to come back inside and sit down. I got to the corner of Ludlow Street and raised my hand in the air to flag down a cab. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't wait to see him. I could have called him and told him I was coming. But I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to see the look on his face. Finally, a yellow cab slowed down and stopped in front of me. I closed my eyes and sighed, a warm feeling spreading throughout my body. This was really happening. I had just managed to stop myself from making the biggest mistake of my life. I was so thankful. From this day forward, I would never leave Leonardo's side. I would go wherever he wanted me to go. And I would do whatever he asked of me. Suddenly, I heard tires screeching. Doors opened and feet rushed toward me. Ah! I screamed. Two men dressed in black grabbed me and threw me into the back of an SUV. The doors slammed shut and the car zoomed off. Please don't hurt me, I begged. I'll give you anything you want. I have lots of money. And real estate. You can have it all. I know it sounded pathetic. But there was nothing else I could do. I'd never seen these men before. But I could tell from their faces that they were mafia guys. Mean, nasty, cruel underworld villains. Not the type of men that you wanted to be surrounded by, especially when you had no one to protect you. There were two guys in the front of the car. They kept their eyes on the road and didn't bother turning around. I was sitting in between the two guys who had snatched me off the street corner just as I was about to get into a cab. And in the row behind me, there were three other guys. I was completely surrounded. I had to get them to talk. I needed to figure out who they were so I would have some idea of how to negotiate with them. But then a grim thought struck me. What if there was no chance of negotiating? What if they didn't want money or property from me? What if they wanted my body? I shivered with disgust as I imagined these sadistic men tearing off my clothes and having their way with me, making me endure the ultimate humiliation before they ended my life and disposed of my corpse. Tears streamed down my cheeks. If only I had stayed with Leonardo, none of this would be happening. This was precisely the kind of thing that he was trying to prevent by locking me in the mansion. He had done it for my own benefit. But I'd been too stupid and stubborn to recognize that. And I'd actually thought that I was going to be able to go abroad and live without his protection. I couldn't even last a couple hours on my own. Suddenly I remembered what happened a week ago when I'd been standing on a street corner, waiting to get picked up and taken to the hospital to visit my father. A black SUV had pulled up and large men had hopped out, grabbed me, and thrown me into the back seat. Those guys had turned out to be part of my father's operation. Maybe this was the same thing. Maybe these men actually worked for my father and were trying to protect me. But if that were the case, why were they being so quiet? I couldn't make sense of that. I had to figure out who they were. "Excuse me, sir," I said to the man in the passenger seat who had his back to me. "Is there any chance that you work for my father, Michael Chambers?" There was a tense moment of silence. I could hear my own breathing. He slowly turned his head towards me. He had a large scar on the side of his face and the most demonic-looking eyes I'd ever seen. Just looking at him made me sick. "Listen up, you dumb bitch," he said. "I'm only going to say this once. We work for the Caravaggios. Have you heard that name before?" I swallowed hard before answering. These were the people who had killed my parents. And now they had their devilish hands on me. This was definitely not going to end well. "I've never heard that name before," I lied. "But I hope." "Shut the fuck up," he screamed. "Everybody has heard that name before, you lying slut. We're the people who toe-tagged your mommy and daddy. Now, does the name ring any bells for you?" Anger surged through me. These men wanted me to submit to them. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to break me. I wasn't going to allow that to happen. "Does the name Leonardo Antonelli ring any bells for you?" I snapped back. "What did you say?" he asked, his eyes growing wide with rage. "I think you know exactly who I am talking about," I replied. "He's the man who—" Before I could finish, a cloth bag was thrown over my head, cutting off my oxygen. They were going to suffocate me. I clawed at the hands that held the bag. But it was no use. I couldn't breathe. I was running out of energy. I wasn't going to be able to hold on much longer. Then suddenly the bag was removed. I gasped, taking in as much air as I possibly could, coughing and struggling to regain my composure. When I looked up, the fat-faced demon was smiling at me. "There's nothing Leonardo can do for you, Miss Caroline. Even though he survived our first hit, he won't survive the next one." I finally managed to catch my breath. I still couldn't believe that they had almost suffocated me. These men were truly evil. "And what are you going to do with me?" I asked, terrified of the answer but unable to contain my morbid curiosity. "We're going to play with you for a little bit, Miss Caroline. I was disappointed to learn that you're not a virgin anymore. What a shame that you would allow an Antonelli cock inside you. But I'm sure you're still very tight. Aren't you?" I had a strong urge to spit in his face. If they were going to kill me, then I wanted them to get it over with. "You're a sick bastard," I said. "No wonder you have to kidnap women to get off." "Don't worry, sweetie. We're all going to take turns getting off on you. And then we're going to put you to sleep right next to your parents."
27. Leonardo. I wasn't going to be able to pace around my office much longer. I needed to go hunting for revenge and blood. I had thrown away my chance at love and there was no one to blame except myself. I'd actually met a woman who understood the burden of my family name. A woman who understood just how evil this mafia world was. A woman who would have been worthy to carry my children and become my wife. I had that happily ever after life in my hands. And I had thrown it away. I'd been too foolish, too egotistical, and too cowardly to hold on to it. For some reason that I still couldn't figure out, I had actually allowed Caroline to walk out of my life. I'd allowed her to head directly into danger without my protection. There was no way that she would be able to survive on her own. I was disgusted with myself. If I couldn't have love, if I couldn't have a wife, a family, and children, then I was going to start a war. I was going to turn the streets of Manhattan red with blood. The ringing of my phone snapped me back to the present moment. I didn't pick it up right away. I had to catch my breath. My chest was heaving. Veins bulged in my neck and forehead. I finally picked it up. It was John Luigi. "Bad news, big bro," he said. "Really fucking bad." "What happened? Did you find the Caravaggios?" "Yeah, we found them," he replied. "We got 3 of them tied up here in the warehouse. We're about to send them on a deep-sea expedition. If you know what I mean." "I think I know what you mean," I said, smiling at my brother's sick sense of humor. So what's the problem? It seems that the Caravaggios sent some of their goons out to snatch the Chambers girl. Your girl? I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. I wanted to respond, but all of a sudden my mouth didn't work. None of the muscles in my body worked. This had to be a dream. A nightmare. At any moment, I was going to wake up in a cold sweat, screaming, cursing, panting, but ultimately relieved that none of it was real. Are those bastards still alive? I asked, finally able to steady myself and recover from the shock. Yeah, but not for too much longer, he replied. You want to talk to them? I ground my teeth. I felt like I was going to crush the phone in my hand. Did I want to talk to them? No. I wanted to wrap my hands around their fucking necks and squeeze until their eyes popped out of their sockets. Give Dino the phone, I said. Dino was the head of the family. According to Wilson's sources, he was the one who had called for the hit on Caroline's parents. If something had happened to her, then there was no doubt in my mind that he was the one who had given the order. Hey, Leonardo, how's it going, buddy? Your girlfriend left you all alone. Must be hard. But don't worry. My men are taking good care of her right now. If anything happens to her, I swear I'll wipe your whole family off the face of the earth. You're some tough guy, Dino responded. You paid $200 million for that slut and my men came along and snatched her right from you. What do you want, Dino? I asked. The girl hasn't done anything to you. Her father tried to ruin my family name. He accused us of doing shoddy construction work. We lost major clients because of that bastard. That's why he and his wife had to die. Now it's his daughter's turn. That has nothing to do with her, you sick fuck. There's no need to be so upset, Leonardo. She's probably in the basement of Vitorino's having her clothes ripped off right as we speak. I'm sure she's going to cry and scream a little bit. But after the first couple of guys get done with her, she'll probably start to enjoy it. Don't you think? He started laughing demonically. I had to get over to Vitorino's. They would be waiting for me. There was no doubt about that. The minute I pulled up in front of the restaurant they would start firing. I wasn't worried about my safety. If I couldn't save Caroline, then the rest of my life wouldn't be worth living anyway. Hey, Leonardo, why are you so quiet? Don't feel bad. She got a taste of some Antonelli cock. Now she's gonna get a much higher quality of. A loud bang cut his words short. It was a gunshot. Sorry about that, Gianluigi said. I just couldn't listen to that fucker anymore. Is he finished? I asked. Yeah, he's done. Time to put the weights on him and toss him in the river. Good. Finish the rest of them. I'm heading to Vitorino's. 28. Leonardo. After finishing the call with Gianluigi, I took a moment to compose myself. I had a chance to make everything right. If I could save Caroline, I would make sure to never let her out of my sight, ever again. And this time she would understand that I was doing it for her own safety. She would understand that in this cruel, dangerous world that we were both born into, there was no such thing as overprotection. I had 2 Glocks on my waist and 2 knives down by my ankles. I also had a bottle of pepper spray and 2 flashbangs, which would serve to stun and disorient my adversaries. Of course, I would also be wearing a Kevlar bulletproof vest. I knew that I was probably going to come under heavy fire. I just hoped that none of their shots hit my head. I knew that the Caravaggios would be expecting me to show up in a bulletproof vehicle, most likely a tinted, black SUV. And that's the kind of car that I would have normally chosen for this type of mission. But I opted against that. Instead, I hopped in one of my navy blue Audis. I revved the engine and turned out of my driveway. I knew that I might never see my glorious mansion ever again. But this wasn't the time for sentimentality. This wasn't the time for reminiscing about the last 100 years of the Antonelli reign in this city. If I was killed while trying to save the love of my life, I was certain that the Antonelli name would continue. Gianluigi would take over and become a great leader. I was sure of that. He was still very raw and enjoyed the violent aspects of our world more than he should have. Yet I was certain that if he were forced to take a leadership role, he would rise to the occasion and mature as much as he needed to. No one would want to go against him. The closer I got to Vitorino's midtown location, the calmer and more focused I became. I had expected to be nervous or worried about the potentially horrible outcome. But I didn't feel any of those emotions. This felt like a date with destiny. I hadn't been able to protect my parents. I hadn't been able to protect my great-grandfather. Now I had the chance to protect a woman that I loved. A woman that I wanted to become my wife and the mother of my children. I parked on 48th Street, which was a couple blocks away from Vitorino's. They had snipers on the roof who wouldn't hesitate to fire if they caught a glimpse of me. But they were probably expecting me to be disguised. But that wasn't going to be the case. I was wearing my standard mafia attire, a perfectly tailored suit and slacks. I turned the corner on 50th Street. The front door of the restaurant was less than 50 feet away. I closed my eyes, took several deep breaths, and smiled. This was it. It was now or never. Once in front of the restaurant, I pulled out one of my Glocks and one of the flashbangs. I put in my earplugs to make sure that the sound wouldn't overwhelm me. These poor bastards weren't going to know what hit them. I counted to 3, then kicked the front door in. "Good afternoon, motherfuckers," I shouted, then tossed the flashbang, which caused a deafening sound. There was a large group of goons sitting at a table. They never had a chance. Before they could recover from the shock, I started firing at them, picking them off one by one. Within a couple minutes, 9 bleeding, mostly lifeless bodies lay on the floor of the 5-star Italian steakhouse. A few of the fuckers were moaning and struggling to push out their last breaths. I did each of them a favor and quickly put them out of their misery. The next order of business was to get down to the basement before those thugs figured out what had happened upstairs. I rushed into the kitchen. The cooking staff threw their hands in the air and begged for mercy. I grabbed a middle-aged cook by the shirt collar and put my pistol to his forehead. "Show me the way to the basement and I'll let you live." He almost pissed himself as he tried to mumble something. Thankfully for him, he was able to point in the direction of the door which led downstairs. I threw him aside with disgust and proceeded with my mission. As I went down the steps into the basement, I reloaded the gun that I'd just fired and pulled out the other one. The lights were on but I couldn't hear anything. Suddenly, panic shot through me. Was I too late? Was I walking into a trap? Or maybe they had heard the commotion upstairs and had been able to escape just in time. Right when I was about to give up hope, I heard voices, grunts, and groans. I hurried down the steps into the main part of the basement. "Stop it! Don't touch me!" It was a woman's voice. It was Caroline. They had her in a room about 30 feet away. The door was halfway open. I saw big bodies with their backs to me, aligned in a semicircle. Rage bubbled in me. I was going to kill every last one of those disgusting bastards if it was the last thing I ever did in my life. "Hey, who the fuck are you?" someone said behind me. I spun around firing, hitting him twice in the chest. He crashed to the floor face first and a large puddle of blood spread underneath him. That got the attention of the savages that were holding Caroline captive. They came streaming out of the room to see what was going on. Before they could draw their weapons, I took them out, one by one, either hitting them in the chest or in the middle of their foreheads. Blood burst from their vital organs as they screamed in agony before dropping to the floor and quickly expiring. I stepped over their corpses, kicking several of their worthless heads as I made my way toward Caroline. She was naked and strapped to a table. She was trying to fight her way out of the ropes that held her down. When she saw me, her eyes opened wide with shock. I grabbed her face and pressed my lips against hers. Our tongues darted in and out of each other's mouths. It was the most passionate kiss that I'd ever had, and it was happening in a room full of dead or soon-to-be dead bodies. That's the world that we lived in. The world that we were born into. "We'll have plenty of time for that later," I said, pulling away from her. "Now we need to get the fuck out of here." I took out my hunting knife and cut the ropes, which had already made deep marks on her skin. I picked her up from the table and threw her over my shoulder. "Not so fast, Antonelli," a voice behind me said. "Ah!" I screamed as a bullet ripped through my shoulder, knocking me off balance. With Caroline still slung over my shoulder, I spun around and started firing at the bastard, who had managed to survive his chest wound. This time I made sure to put the bullet right between his eyes. He fell limply to the floor. "Are you okay?" Caroline asked. "I'll be fine," I said, grimacing and making my way toward the exit. I kicked open the door which led to a back alley. A black SUV came speeding towards us. "They're going to kill us!" Caroline screamed. The car skidded to a stop. The driver's side door opened and John Luigi hopped out. He rushed towards us. When he saw that Caroline was naked, he hurried back to the car, grabbed a blanket, and threw it over her. Then he helped us both into the backseat. As we sped out of the alley and towards the West Side Highway, we could hear the sound of police sirens and helicopters arriving on the scene.
29. Caroline. The last couple of hours had been a blur. I was still trying to make sense of what happened. I'd been stripped naked and strapped to a table in a basement. The Caravaggio thugs were licking their chops, undoing their belt buckles, lowering their zippers, and reaching into their boxers. I felt nauseous. I tried screaming. I tried breaking free from the ropes. But it was no use. They laughed at me as they prepared to ravish my body. I knew that once they were done with me, they were definitely going to kill me. But before they had been able to make me submit to their deviant desires, a loud bang had gone off in the basement. The excitement drained from their faces. They tried as quickly as possible to pull their pants up and draw their weapons. But they never had a chance. Leonardo's gun blew holes in them, one after the other. I'd never seen anything like that. He had risked his life and gone up against all those men to save me. What if next time we weren't so lucky? What if members of the Caravaggio family came after us seeking revenge? I didn't want to think about any of those questions. I was just happy to be alive. And I was even happier to be laying on the couch in Leonardo's office. I had my head in his lap. His hand was lightly stroking my hair. I looked up at him and smiled. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" he asked. "A little tired. But much better than I was doing a few hours ago." He smiled, then grimaced. He touched the bandage on his shoulder and looked away from me. "I'm sorry you got shot," I said. "It's all my fault. I should have stayed with you." He shook his head. "It's not your fault that I got shot. And yes, you should have stayed with me. But I shouldn't have let you leave." "So what were you going to do, just lock me in here against my will?" He sighed and rolled his eyes. "I was only doing it." I sat up on the couch and pressed my mouth to his. We kissed softly several times, then I pulled my head back and stared deeply into his eyes. "I love you," I said. I'd been waiting so long to say those words. I had wanted to say them days ago, but I was afraid that maybe I was rushing things. I was terrified that he didn't feel the same way about me. "I love you too," he replied. "And from this day forward I'm going to do everything in my power to protect you. Whether you like it or not." My eyes lit up. A warm energy spread throughout my body. It felt so good to hear him say those words. "And what if I refuse?" I replied, playfully. "What are you going to do then?" He didn't answer right away. His lips curled into a sly smile. "Then I'm going to drag your ass to the dungeon and teach you how to obey." I like the sound of that," I said, leaning forward and kissing him, our tongues twisting and twirling passionately in and out of each other's mouth. Suddenly, he pulled his head back and gently wrapped his fingers around my throat. "I think that just for asking me that question, you deserve to be punished." Whenever his fingers wrapped my neck, I instantly became wet, and this occasion was no different. "If that's what you think I deserve, then I have no choice but to obey." "That's what I like to hear," he said, picking me up in his powerful arms and carrying me out of his office.
Epilogue. Leonardo. 2 years later. "I was afraid that once we got married and had a child, you would stop bringing me down here," Caroline said as I laid her on the padded table and began tightening the straps around her ankles and wrists. I smirked and shook my head. "Well, our wedding was over a year ago. And it's been almost 6 months since you and Vincenzo came home from the hospital. I was afraid you wouldn't want to touch me after seeing me in the delivery room," she said. "I think I'm going to be extra rough with you today," I replied. "Why?" "Because of all the nonsense coming out of your mouth. But I have to admit that being in the delivery room for the birth of my first child was more intense than anything I've ever experienced." "Even the shootout with the Caravaggios?" I walked away from her momentarily and picked up a medium-sized magic wand vibrator. I was going to tease her with it until she begged me to stop. Then I was going to pleasure her with my mouth and fingers before I finished off by shooting a huge load inside of her. During the shootout, I felt like I was in complete control. In the hospital, I felt completely helpless. But I was more than willing to choke the life out of that doctor if anything went wrong. "Leonardo. Don't say that. It's the truth. And I think he could sense it. You're crazy. Why don't you?" Her words were cut short as she felt the spinning head of the vibrator pressed against her pussy lips. She closed her eyes and moaned. "Oh, that feels so good. A little bit higher. Yes, yes, yes. Right there." It made me so hard to see her enjoying herself. I squeezed the bulge in my pants. I should have stripped down to my boxers before I began playing with her. Her mouth was half open. I had a burning desire to shove my cock in between her soft, beautiful lips. With my free hand, I undid my belt buckle and pushed my pants down my legs. Then I stepped out of my boxers. I put the wand down for a moment and took off my shirt. Caroline turned her head toward me, looked me up and down, licked her lips, and smiled. "Are you hungry for something?" I asked, picking the wand up and moving it between her legs. The head spun like crazy against her engorged clit. A sheen of sweat spread across her deliciously pale flesh. Her thighs began to quiver. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head. I made sure to keep the vibrator in place as I pushed my throbbing, rock-hard cock in between her slightly parted lips. She sucked on the head, twirling her tongue around it. What an amazing feeling. "Don't stop," she said. "Don't stop. I'm gonna come." I tried my best to hold on to my load. But I wasn't going to be able to last much longer. She looked so fucking sexy as she writhed, moaned, and quivered. She let out a long sigh as her thighs continued shaking uncontrollably. I leaned my head back, moaned, and shot a huge load into her throat. She sucked on the head of my cock, making sure that she caught every drop in her mouth. For a few moments, we stared at each other in silence, panting and sweating, trying to catch our breath and recover from our intense orgasms. "Suck on my pussy, then come here and kiss me," she said. I smiled. What a nasty girl. I put my head between her thighs, licked up and down the labia, and sucked on the ultrasensitive clit head. She smiled. "Now come up here," she said. "I want to taste myself." Within seconds our mouths were locked on each other as we passed our love juices back and forth, sloshing them from one mouth to the next. It was the hottest, dirtiest, sexiest kiss I'd ever had. "I love you, baby," I said. "I love you too, sweetie." After our steamy session was finished, I freed her from the restraints, picked her up from the table, and carried her out of the room in my arms. She let her head rest against my chest as we walked toward the elevator. The end.
Thank you for listening. This has been a production of LFD Romance Books. The Antonelli's story continues in Book 2, John Luigi Antonelli. Enjoy.